Boy Boys, Dos Zekis, Master Signified Bodies, followed by Free Beer Tomorrow. Nick, what are we going over today?
What's up? Today we will be going over a materialist definition of consciousness. That is chapter 4 of seminar 2. And the name of the seminar I cannot retain. What is it? The
Oh, it's
ego
yeah,
in Freud's
Freud's theory and in technique of
theory
psychoanalysis.
and in technique of psychoanalysis. It doesn't exactly roll off
Nah,
the tongue.
not like
That's
Freud's
not
papers on
the
technique.
Freud's papers on technique. That was nice and gentle,
Yeah,
eminently sayable.
yeah. Even like,
Uh,
is it seminar 3? Was it on psychosis? Like simple, but like this is like the longest one, right?
the most garrulous of all the titles. And you know, he's not sparing anything.
Right,
There.
right.
That's not Lacan's way. These we were just talking about how these two seminars are criminally ignored by many, maybe two more so than one, but for analysts, they're of prime, they're of prime importance, I would say.
Right, right.
You know,
Everybody wants to go to like the other ones, like 5 and above, right? Because 5 is like his theory of desire, and then you got like uh 9 and 10, like identification and anxiety.
yeah,
11 is the one where it's like you have that like the concretized breakdown of like, oh, this is what psychoanalysis is, like the 4 fundamental concepts. But it's like looking at seminar 1, you could see all that in there being used, and like now like we've elaborated and categorized specific techniques of psychoanalysis. If there were to be a set of principles, it's transference, unconscious, the drive, and repetition.
right. But that's the thing, is that everyone wants to jump ahead to the general principles. And what's interesting about seminar 1 and 2 is how he focuses very carefully on the connection between the meta commentary and the principles, and warns people away from trying to extrapolate from these principles a technique. It's like there is a technique involved, and we were just talking about this in like one of the last, maybe it was the last episode, where it's like, yeah, or maybe it's the first one, I think, from the introduction, but there is a technique involved here, but the deployment of that technique is not one and the same as understanding
Right.
the principles involved. And I think that as time went on and he became more and more of a thinker and theorist of analysis in his own right, that he became less charitable and like less attentive to his pupils in that sense. I could be wrong. I haven't read enough, but like he's more into, okay, here's my theory.
Right. These math
If you're too stupid to, and we're all too stupid to understand math themes, don't get me wrong, but like if you're too stupid to understand the separation between technique and the meta commentary,
right.
then poor you. But like
Yeah,
here he's like, he's careful to distinguish the two.
Yeah, like you could see like seminars 1 and 2 is like making the band, and then after that it's like he's just like he's on his own thing.
Right? Hippolyte's like, this is crazy, man. Manoni's like, who are the 5 greatest analysts in the world? Manoni. You got like randos that are kicked off like right away. They're only there for Page, Dr. X.
Freaking Lacan's like, all right, I'm gonna tell you about the blind alleys of Ballant, but first I'm gonna need you to go all the way down to Perry and get me 3 knots, right?
Exactly. That sounds like something he would do, because it's like way to break the transference, sending people off on foolish, convoluted errands,
And then like how like on that scene where like Dave Chappelle's laying on the couch, and then like they fucking pick up the couch, the dudes pick up, it's like, or like they have the dudes carry him. It's like Batari's carrying him on his back. That's perfect right there. You got D&G
yeah.
just escorting him out.
Cody's gonna get upset with us for that one.
Yeah.
We should also announce that we will be coming out with a new series very soon. We hope to record our first session this Saturday. We'll be reading a little known book called The Sublime Object of Motherfucking Ideology. Why didn't that one get past the peer review? It was supposed to have motherfucking in the title.
Exactly.
Well, know that. And we're going to be reading it chapter to chapter. A group of us. We've got some affiliates coming through, some really cool peeps, and we're going to be looking at every face and every angle.
Yeah, the
of
group's
that
called
wonderful, wonderful book.
Sublime Object of Idiocracy. That's our
Yep.
group. Yep, you know, and ideology, it's what every pervert craves. Just like Gatorade, right? Electrolytes, what every plant craves.
It's gonna be maybe five of us, five radical psychic autists.
Yeah. So
radical psychotic autists.
Right. It's gonna be sick.
All right, so
I think. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm just gonna share the old screen here.
Right. I think what's really fascinating about this one, like, is you get a lot, like I was saying, like a lot of like perspective in how the optical schema operates, but then like the meaning of the image and like the relationship of the ego, and the image. But like we said, was it in the last one of how not only is the ego, you know, an imaginary aspect, but it's also a symbol used as a sign, right? To signify a certain object. I forget what chapter it was, but you remember that, right? So I think it's also fascinating. It's like the ego takes itself into perspective in its own, you know, lure as a fascinating object. And I use the word fascinating because like we'll get into that towards the end. It's obviously right here on the title, the subtext of like fascination, rivalry, and recognition, right? This is all part of the imaginary aspect, but there's this also symbolic aspect to it, which deals with the fight for recognition, through a rivalry, and even in mirroring, there's the form of mastery, right? There's a lot of Hegelianism, but I think like to kind of sum up what I'm saying, it's like we should see this not only in the ego's need for recognition and even having rivalry for that, but in the case that this happens in the analyst or in the analytic session where there becomes a rivalry with the patient and the analyst, because at certain points the analyst doesn't feed into the demands, therefore like then the patient's ego sees the analyst as the master that they need to overcome for the most part to be the master.
Right, and I think that has to do with seeing the analyst as the subject supposed to know, in that even the attainment of knowledge, I think, has some kind of corollary with the mirror stage, in that it's like just as you want to attain the mastery of the image, you'd want to attain the mastery of that knowledge, because it's like the knowledge itself is of a certain form. It's like we tend to think of knowledge as having this sort of this nectar to it, this content. We, especially in this scientific, to use one of the terms he uses, era that we live in, knowledge has this certain color, this certain hue that has to do with not its form, but its content, its flavor. That what there's always a kind of sensory or sensorial sort of understanding of knowledge, which has a very empirical empiricist sort of tradition,
Right.
but it's the form of knowledge. And what's the form of knowledge? Well, the form of knowledge, at least at this point, is conforming to a kind of intersubjective relation where if you have it, then I don't. I want it. I take it from you, and then I become its possessor, and then you've become defeated or sublated
Mhm.
within my paradigm, let's say. And it's the not having the knowledge that creates the paradox, which that creates the dilemma of the session that emerges in the session, I think, where the satisfaction of the demand only perpetuates the conflict. But if there is, to quote our friend Dr. Hook, a systematic refusal of the demand, it puts
Right.
the analysand in a difficult and impossible sort of situation.
Yeah. I think that's correct. And like one thing I wanted to kind of piggyback on was when you were talking about science, and like I think it's really interesting to note the what he said in seminar one, talking about like meditation on optics, right? Because every science like tries to reduce, its thing in this object in inquiry, like with biology, right? The reduction to, a cell, physics, and atom. With optics, it's not even the eye, it's the image, right? That's what he was saying. And the thing about an image is like an image is not something that's reductive, it's actually like a totality. But even a mirror, or an image as an object of inquiry does require observation, but it also has this mirroring to it, right? Images always reflect off of surfaces too. And he like his whole thing about like, the bouncing of light off of a mirror, or like our eyes, our optical, setup, but it pretty much creates like the image in our minds, or it allows light to bounce back and forth to create like different perspectives of the image. So it's like you can never really reduce images down to a certain thing. Rather, images are always being like, in a sense, mirrored, like bouncing back and forth to create more different perspectives. And I think to put it in like the way that makes sense for psychoanalysis, it's like we're talking about the lure, and the lure has multiple things for us. I know for animals, it's like they're always jammed by just lures, but for us, like we try to find a way to situate it, right? Because it was making me think of like we should see that optical schema as like even in that video that you showed me, the thing is moving, that little concave mirror, but it's only like at that point that you get the connection between the upside down vase and the flowers, so you get that virtual image, right? And even when you lose it and it revolves, you're anticipating that virtual image to come back a second time, a third time. And imagine it not going there. That loses coherency of the egos, or the observers, like, anticipation, or the way that they see it. So imagine it never coming. And it seems like that is like, in a sense, how the need to situate and the need to mirror. Does that like kind of make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that put into perspective, no pun intended, certain aspects of the ego as an image, because there are always gaps and blind spots within the ego. Maybe the ego is almost held together by its gaps and blind spots, and is something, let's say, that is circulating to the degree that we're always trying to capture it at a certain moment, hence captation. There is a kind of anticipation of its arrival, right? And we talked to Dr. Hook about the anticipatory dimension of time and the ego. And there is this sense that it's also arrived too late. Well, now we're talking about the subject. I don't want to conflate the two.
No,
But the
definitely.
ego is the image that would have a sort of stability that exists to counteract
Yeah.
an instability in phenomena, but it can't really be placed at a certain point.
Right,
And
right.
that's what the optical schema is meant to convey, is that there is no one emanational point for the ego, I think. And it's like we jealously guard it because what we're guarding is the illusion of a centeredness to it, and the decenterment that happens in the session results in a identification of the, like, let's say the serpentine kind of snakiness of the symptom that eludes everything attempted by the attempt to fuse the different parts of the ego together, when you're really just dealing with a junk drawer of different incompatible items, memories, experiences, but not even experiences. That's one of the things that he's going to talk about here, is it's like psychological experience, and the sum of these experiences is not the object we are after exactly. If we're analysts, you know what I mean? It's like that's important, that plays into it, but trying to hold it all together, trying to sew these different experiences together in a way that creates coherency, that creates an episteme for the analysand, is not the purpose of analysis. That only reinforces the illusion of an identification, of self-identification, an identification with the image.
Yes, and I think it's also cool to bring up the whole thing you're saying. It's like the ego kind of moves from its gaps, or it's like determined by even like its gaps, that like it's not all whole. It's like we were just talking about in the last chapter, the what does he describe as a perturbation in the symbolic order? Like there's a crack, and like you can see it like that even in like not just the ego as imaginary, but as the ego as structuring a symbolic, right, narrative.
That's interesting, because I know Andrew made a meme about me always bringing surplus enjoyment into every discussion, but it's the latest Zizek book I read. I want to put a review of it on the channel. I don't think it's his best, but it's
definitely good.
Nothing he writes is bad in my book. I simp for him, so you already know. But it's like with him in that book, he talks about how the symbolic order cannot account for its own lack. Really, there's no place for lack within the symbolic order, and yet the lack must be inscribed within the symbolic order as this cut that is the subject, and the subject doesn't know what to do with itself, because the symbolic order doesn't know what to do with itself as a non-totalizable register, whatever you want, realm, kingdom of different items. And it's like it cannot totalize itself, and it is that inability to totalize itself which ultimately results in the expulsion of that which is exterior to it, the lack. And yet the lack is in some sense included in it. The lack is what actually it gets it up and running. It's a kind of paradox.
Yes.
And that, I think, now we're talking about the subject, so it's very difficult to like include the ego in that, but the ego as the image, right? Again, the image is like that which would make the symbolic order whole, in a sense. I could be wrong about that. I'm just spitballing, but
I think we shouldn't like get too caught up in the subject, at least how it's elaborated later on in Lacan. True. But he says in here, and even in the first seminar, but like mainly it's in this one, of how the subject or the ego is the misrecognized aspect of the subject, of the subjectivity. So in that sense, it's an alienated, image. So we never know about the subject because the ego misrecognizes it. The ego is fascinated and lured by the image. But then like there are the cracks and everything, and like leading up to like kind of going into the text. I think one thing too is the fact of this subject in an alienated form of the ego, like as he says, animates the experience, and it gives it meaning. But then like in the case of like what analysis is observing in someone's ego, and the fact that like, oh, like they can't enjoy anymore, they don't desire like the way they desired, or like they're dealing with a neurotic in this case. We get like resistances, right? And those resistances are also like that which is like trying to avoid symbolization, but the imaginary aspect as well, and like frustration and all these different like rivalry aspects of the ego and its mirroring.
So
And then, yeah,
yeah, the what happens in the session then is like a kind of unusual form of mirroring.
it seems to like be the condition of the transference that like the analyst wants to mirror, or even in like resisting, is still trying to find some like captation or captivation in the analyst, right? It still needs that like his or whatever is their recognition. Um,
It seems
and,
like no, sorry, go ahead.
and the fact it's like, with the analyst's job is to be like just to listen, and in the Freudian sense, be a blank slate, because you're not trying to counter transfer or give them a set of rules or guidelines or demands like CBT does, or any other form of like psychotherapy, in which the therapist counsels you, guides you, and works with you. Even in like mental health culture today, it's like, you could think of me as your other friend, right?
Yeah, it's like a state appointed friend.
Right, exactly. So then you're already situated in some way. There was the speech right there, friend. What if like, somebody is really like in their life, like they like lost a tragic friend. So then therefore it's like that like triggers something. I don't mean like triggering like the way it's used, but like that like initiates a response of like, oh, all these like different feelings and demands in the affective level of, losing a friend come up, and therefore they kind of try to mirror that, how they were with their friend, with their analyst, or with their therapist or whatever.
It just made me think of how like when it comes to therapy culture and the ego psychology that's predominant
Yeah,
in our culture, it's like we talk about recognition in this kind of discourse very often, that is, that refers to like it's general lack in a lot of people's lives, and like people want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they feel ignored. But what's interesting is that like that being ignored brings with it a kind of enjoyment too, which still acts as a kind of mirroring. Like even if you feel unappreciated, or people don't recognize your talents, or even worse, you have no friends, or you're totally isolated, there is a mirror in other people's indifference to you in a strange way.
right.
But like,
And you can see that now with TikTok and stuff like that, and all these different, things where your image is captured. So it gets that intention.
so, but like what I'm saying is like whether you get the attention or not, there's
Yeah.
still a kind of mirroring. What happens in
Yeah.
the analytic session is a third thing where you are neither ignored nor mirrored in the sense of everyday
Right.
recognition. What happens is the mirror itself is sort of, it faces itself almost. I feel like that's what the transference is. In that
Right.
you're brought to the extreme of the mirror as obstacle. What do you
Yeah.
think of
And
that? I
like,
don't know if that resonates with you, but
I mean, it's definitely like a unique metaphor. I don't see it being like wrong or anything. I do think that there is an obstacle in maintaining the transference without it conducting into countertransference, if that makes sense, on the part of the analyst. making sure that they're speaking and free associating without resisting or again, we got to repeat demands, desires, because in the transference we get this notion of love, right? And in this mirroring, in a sense, there is this symbolization of loving your analyst in a way. And sometimes it could be literal, where uh, the patient literally falls in love with the analyst. And there's that having to fight that, because it's a narcissistic man to or demand to really mutilate and eat away at the analyst to get the thing that you believe that they have that they can't see, right?
That they're keeping, or that they're willing, deliberately
Yeah,
keeping from you to torture
exactly.
you, essentially.
Yeah, to be very Lacanian about it.
Isn't that like maybe what's going on in my backdrop there? The point of taking notes isn't necessarily just to remember something, but also maybe it's part of the whole experience of it, in that like you're trying to make it seem as if you're figuring something out, like
Yeah,
you're performing all these like equations and
yeah,
carrying out these like mathematical formula. Like,
right.
what could you possibly be writing about me where it's like
Yeah,
there's some answer
right. It's
there.
like, what are you writing about? Like, I need to know this. You tell me now, right? That's the hysterical demand. Really, just drawing like a picture of a cat, like a doodle or something like that.
Because it's like, because it's also like you feel like an object in that moment,
Right.
and the whole point of like analysis is to get you to, and subjective destitution is to get you to experience yourself as an object, in a sense.
Mm. That's interesting. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, but which maybe we could tenuously connect, as people do in podcasts and stuff, to transition into their ad breaks and whatever, like the um statement he makes here about Freud and his Copernican revolution, and he summarizes it very aptly, saying, discovered in man the substance and the axis of a subjectivity surpassing the individual organization considered as a sum of individual experiences. So, whereas like someone who hasn't studied Freud much might think, oh, okay, so Freud discovered psychology. So, but like Freud discovered that people's experiences are actually important to their formation. Like, no, that would have already predated Freud. Like, I think to a certain extent, maybe at least in a post-enlightenment world, people understood that they were the sum of their experiences, supposedly. But what Freud discovers is something different, is essentially the subject. And the subject is not just the sum of one's experiences.
Right, right. And like it makes me think of like even like what Hume was saying, like trying to say like that, there is no I, um or like he was like self in philosophical terms. It's like rather like a bundle of there's like different impulses and sensations that like we create like a unified notion of ourselves in it. And I'm not saying like psychoanalysis is Humean in a sense. I think they take a radical different approach, but I kind of see some similarity to the fact it's like, well, yeah, we're like the sum of all these things, but rather it's something totally different, of like something that decentered. And then even like Hume is focusing more on like on a philosophical level of identity, not necessarily on how the ego, yeah, it's definitely decentered. It's not like just the sum of all things, but there's a dialectic to it. It seems like the negation of its determinations does negate that as well, and it's like always keeping it moving forward. And of course, there's a repetition to it.
Right. And it it's the repetition that keeps the symbolic universe going, for lack of a better expression. It's sort of like this is was always a hard concept to grasp for me. I still don't think I totally get it, but that with the concept being the time of the thing, it's like through the repetition of it that
Right.
something emerges. And I guess you could see even the attunement to a certain object is what allows that object to be. And in a bit, he's going to talk about the Sartre's thetic versus non-thetic consciousness. It becomes thetic the moment that we, in the Heideggerian sense, are attending to something, right? When something becomes not ready to hand, but what is the opposite?
So there's present at hand and ready to hand.
Ready to hand is when you're actually like consciously attending to it, right?
No,
Or
ready
that's
to hand, that would be present at hand. Ready to hand is so much like that in our everydayness, we get absorbed by the world and the things, and we don't really take notice of the interactions, because it's like almost like they're readily available. It's only through like something happening or something that kind of disturbs the routine, that then things become present at hand. The hammer stops working, you're so readiness to hand because it becomes readiness to hand for our use, but we forget like the function of the hammer or just don't even acknowledge it because it's second nature and a part of our everydayness. But as soon as the hammer stops working, or maybe like we need the hammer and we can't find it, it's like now it comes into perspective, or our presence at hand where we create conceptions.
right. So I'm thinking there's actually a connection between a sort of presence at hand and a repetition, even in the sense of like how we signify, of repeatedly attaching a signifier to something
Mm-hmm.
and endlessly kind of replaying a certain signifier brings the world into view. I don't want to say attaching it to something. Maybe that something is always the thing, but this bringing the world into view gradually through the repetition of a certain signifier
Okay, yeah.
is like the thetic consciousness that is employed in different moments to actually create a world for the subject. The world that's created for the subject, this like symbolic universe that we're talking about. I think that he's, like in the last lecture, he's talking about how the specific contingencies of the helix of the mollusk shell are a dead end in terms of like investigation if one's looking for something platonic to emerge of the form through
Right.
looking at the specificities of the contingent shapes and sounds and colors of a thing. It's sort of
Right.
like what's of importance here is the status of knowledge, and that the symbolic order, how would I put this? The symbolic order seen as an episteme, as
Mm-hmm.
it's seen throughout the history of philosophy, doesn't render much. What happens is Descartes said, let's do away with all contingencies, bring everything to bear on that one point from which everything converges, this self-transparent consciousness, and then let's start over. We'll build from there, and we will rebuild the world in a more or less scholastic manner, right? It's still a world countenanced by God and like within the mind of God. But of course, some of the consequences of that are what we were talking about in the last session. It leads to a kind of deism, a God as watchmaker. There are many different Cartesian paths you could take from there. The reason I think that he wants to take things back to the cogito is not to say like, hey, like let's not try to understand how forms inhere in the specific geni of different particulars. That's not what's important here. What's important is the status of this episteme. What's important is knowledge of this episteme and what knowledge means. the meaning of knowledge is revealed through the analytic session, the connection between the analyst and analysand, in that one understands their relation to knowledge, their demand for things to conform in this formal way to a certain episteme. So I think what's happening in this chapter is he says, like, let's take a look at consciousness, what it means when it's drained of all contingencies, or what the symbolic order means separated from the consciousness. The only sort of mediating factor there would be then the ego, which is this image which is illusory. And I'm just kind of ping-ponging around here, but
Right.
does
Yeah,
any of
because
this
it's
make sense?
because like if we take the philosophical aspect and like really add psychoanalysis to it, it's like it's never just a thinking eye, right? The eye is always reflecting on the other, like the eye is the other, but there's more to just the cognitive or just the contemplative element of what we could call the cogito. There's also the fantasy and it recreating itself in a certain scenario, um, and the fact it's like it's structured by language, right? Like with Descartes, it seems like, yeah, we could just doubt everything, like you're saying, because of contingency and trying to find, uh, like necessity. And it's necessarily important that I ground knowledge in a thinking eye first, or any possibility of knowledge, but not even like the fact it's like, well, that your knowledge of that um, is grounded in some sort of discourse, right? That even takes a life of its own.
Which is his take on the cogito, therefore, is where I don't think is where I am.
Mm-hmm.
The unconscious. I think I said that right.
Yeah.
Like, where I don't think is where I am. This is the unconscious. And I think this is what's going to gradually come to the surface here, is the place of this unconscious. And he wants to, as always, warn us away from trying to make these sort of false equivalencies between, this is why I think he says, oh, well, don't take this eye as a kind of mouthwash. And you can sort of throw that statement out there whenever, in an attempt to appear clever or interesting, because you don't yet understand what it is, because all you've done is recuperate the ego as the other, and you've gotten nowhere.
Right.
That's what you're doing.
You just let the substance out of one door and bring it back into another door. Like, what he said earlier about, or the last one about, like, with the symbolic order, being the next God, pretty much. Yeah, and then you kind of see like Chiesa talk about that too with incompleteness theory. It's like, don't use that as a mouthwash, right? Like we have to really be critical about like the incompleteness and not make it a meta language.
That's
right?
a really good point.
Right.
Right, because it seems like he implies a kind of corrective to what Zizek is doing in his sort of frenzied,
right.
sniff laden, constant hurtling forward through concepts and putting and synthesizing things at the like Tasmanian like devil pace that he does. It's like Chiesa wants to make sure that what is not surreptitiously posited or postulated in the process is just like another plane in which meaning terminates and becomes self-resolved. It's like we need to make sure that the whole adherence to there is no meta language includes itself as metalinguistically impossible.
Right.
But we're getting pretty abstract.
I really like the fact though right here, like in this page, 41, where he talks about like Levi Strauss, like relativizing the familial reality, because it's like that you could take as like something of um like we take like the family and face value as like this just like given thing that it's like necessarily the case, like in the aspect of the bourgeois family, the nuclear family, like as if that's the universal phenomenon everywhere. And you even see this in like conservative talking points. It's like the problem of the society really boils down to is the breaking up of the family, right? We need to have those family values, like these transcendental things. That's not the case. And Levi Strauss shows this with kinships and how they operate, and how even if there is a resemblance of a nuclear family and some type of kinship, it doesn't operate in the same manner or anything. Rather, it's structured by certain other elementary things and gestures. And I guess like what does he have that book where it's like literally like talking about the different like types of foods and garments and stuff like that, like that structure, like the family or whatever.
Right. And it's like,
Yeah.
because we, again, to use the same metaphor as before, we let the family in the back
Right.
door after leading it out the front door. Again, if we see everything as this para animal formation, I think is the way he refers to it in the previous chapter, where it's sort of like, well, we've just restored the family to this universal status, even though we're supposed to like everything's supposed to be a like kind of decoloration of the contingencies that would give us a kind of universal. But as soon as we make, yeah, like family synonymous with the symbolic substance, the structure of the symbolic order, then we're back to Oedipus.
Right, right. It's exactly it.
And extremely disorienting relativism. Or we're saying like Levi Strauss is a nerd, and that's the problem. He's just like, he's too much of a nerd, and I think that's the issue everybody has with him. It's kind of like, well, what is this fetishistic obsession with all the like little details of alliances and kinship systems? It's like, yeah, you know a lot. You can tell
Mhm.
us a lot about all of these different societies and indigenous peoples, but like, what does it ultimately amount to unless we have a notion of what the symbolic order is structurally speaking?
Yeah, yeah. You said a nerd.
Well, he
Yeah.
kind of is.
Just geeking out on plans and alliances and kinships.
Yeah, he's like someone who knows everything about Pokemon.
Right. Or like
No
he
offense, I
like
think that's cool if you do, but like, but he seems like someone who would like tell you about all of the Pokemon like against your consent.
right. No, I feel like he'd be a really good like D&D or like Magic the Gathering player.
No, he wouldn't, because he would be like too obsessed with the rules, and like he would just get, it would be no fun with him. He would just be one of the people who like took it way too seriously.
That's funny. But like right here where he talks about like then like the relativization of the family, then we reoriented with the subject of the child, right? Or the point of view of the child is where the family is restored. And then he's just like, what we analysts have to deal with is the relation of the child to the parents, right? And I think right here is what gets, well, he says right here is what gets us, it keeps us from like this extremely disorienting relativism that pretty much with Levi Strauss, gets done away. But even if there isn't, in a sense, like a structure of a nuclear family in what like Levi Strauss does, it doesn't mean that there isn't this like relation to, the family of some sort with the child's experience. And I think that's what like psychoanalysis at least wants to kind of be like, yo, wait up. There's still this like notion of like experiences that the child has in the family, because no matter what, the function of society does, in a sense, you know, play as a focal point in the family, but it doesn't really necessarily start. Well, I shouldn't say that, but like it in a sense does start with the family, but it doesn't, because there's already a bunch of givens of the symbolic system there that allow for the family to exist. But in the child, its first immediate experiences with the symbolic order and authority, prohibition, and enjoyment, and ways to rebel to find enjoyment, all do circulate in the sort of family structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I took it in the wrong direction there, but you brought us back down to earth here.
Yeah. But
Um,
it's not in the way of like conservative bros are just like, the family is everything. These woke leftists want to destroy the family. It's just like, yeah, but you gotta also think the children are learning more, from other people from their family. A lot of kids hate their parents, these days. And even then they still want to bring the, ideology of capitalism and the emphasis of the nuclear family in mirroring other people, whether it's at school or daycare or what, even if, their family is a hellhole, like, they come from a broken home, or maybe they lived in an orphanage, they are still going to replicate the structures of the symbolic order of capitalism and its emphasis on the nuclear family onto other people.
right. So, do you think what Lacan's getting at here is that with the development of the child and their ego, that society itself, the symbolic order, intervenes to shape that development, that there's a whole series of mirrorings that occur that allow for the emergence of the ego as like the summation of all of those mirrorings, but
Right,
it takes
right,
place within the
right.
microcosm of the family.
Hmm. Definitely. And they're already thrown into a sort of language or discourse, right? So, and it can even start from the fact of like, the baby being in the womb, and it's like the dad is like bringing the headphones of like his favorite song. It's like, oh, I just want to make sure that they grow up listening to some good music. So he's playing like Metallica, and it's like, some stuff like that. Like, who knows? He's like the baby's already
Right.
into secondary narcissism, castrated, right?
And then whether you try to resist that or go with it, whatever your parents' tastes are, or whatever they structured for you, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because the language of it is either going to be formed by your rebellion against it, or it'll just fall right in line with what was already set up for you in many ways. So it's the general landscape is already there
Right, right.
for you. There's no way to be truly individual.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But isn't he also sort of critiquing this approach to understanding this ego as resting on the sort of like uncovering of the inner child, this ego psychology sort of presupposition that if we can like give a voice and a kind of character to the inner child, then everything else sort of comes with it.
Yeah, right. And it's not to say like his focus on the child is like something of like, oh, embracing the inner child. I think like his emphasis on the child is the fact of maybe a sort of like retroactivity, like as so long as we like are in analysis, right? So if like we're free associating, then like people start going on about something, and then they say, well, this reminds me of like when I was a kid, and they really get lost of like what it was like to be a kid. So like the maybe not the actual kid themselves, but the structuring of the the subject's history playing out in the image that they have of a child and kind of recreating. It's like sort of a recreating of a scene, trying to get at it. It seems like, and it's always leading to failure. And even to elaborate on the fact is like when he wants to talk about the child, right? I even said his retroactivity. That's a key word. He's not like um, saying that we need to look at the perspective of the child um, and the child's like view of the parents in some type of like developmental process, like DSM-5 bros and just regular like pop psychology wants to emphasize like this linear teleological development and like, oh, the reason why you're like this is because in your childhood you had this and now it's like, well, and the fact it's like, yeah, kids can have traumatic experiences and then that will affect them later on in life, but it's never the fact that this happened at this time, therefore now you are like this, like A plus B equals C type mentality. It's more of a fact of like, no, maybe that doesn't happen at all. In fact, maybe you had like maybe you were like traumatized as a kid by some experience, and then later on in life then you have another traumatic experience. There could be some type of interwoven connectedness to a sort of trauma and fantasy. And I want to say this key thing that Sarah brought up is that there's a difference between the fantasy and the trauma. And yes, with trauma there is a fantasization, but sometimes trauma you forget about it because you don't want it to be brought up into fantasy or you don't want to remember it at all. So in a sense, there's repression, but it's not necessarily the fact that you're fantasizing about the trauma. Although when it does come up into like it is brought up and it's sort of like these registers, then I think there is this like kind of avoidance and or even like in this working this compulsion to repeat. But what I'm trying to say is that it's going back to the whole notion of the child. It's like it's nothing is for Lacan. It's developmental. It's always structural.
Is it well? But what you said is really interesting there. That maybe the fantasy can conceal a traumatic episode, and trauma, these scenes of trauma, are what the analyst is trying to home in on in some way. So you still, in some sense, need to appeal to the analysand's fantasy to reconstruct any moment of historicity.
Right,
When
right,
you say so, it's like understanding the analysand's specific fantasy is understanding where they're situated within a symbolic universe. And this is where ideology
right,
would come in, not so much in terms of, oh, the subject's values, the patient's interpretations of the world, they like trying to reconstruct that in terms of like, here's their like the coherency of the system that
right,
they rely on to understand the world. But with the materiality of signifiers, it's like, what is the exact material, or not material in terms of like content, but the materiality of the fantasy itself? How can I
right, right,
shape that to bring it back to make it somehow flow into these cuts,
right,
to
and
reveal the presence of these cuts?
exactly. And so far we're talking about Oedipalization, right? There is fantasy, but not like necessarily trauma, right? To hide. Rather, it's more of like the fantasy hides the desire of like this obsession, or maybe that the obsessional fantasy is really fantasies do hide, right? They censor the real, right? They censor the resistances, um or not censor, they kind of act as what do you say in seminar 11, they kind of like fill in those deadlocks from the
Right.
you know right, but in a sense it's like the way fantasy operates in a Oedipal neurotic is not the same way of like a trauma or like a somebody who becomes neurotic because of traumatic experiences. And literally it's a fear and frightened. So they're afraid to have any fantasy. They don't want anything to do with that. And in fact, they forget it. And when a fantasy, maybe a fantasy does have happen of it, they get scared. Or a nightmare, right? It freaks them out. But because they're not trying to construct the scene of that.
Right. The fantasy is kind of a scene, but also helps you to avoid maybe what it's aiming towards, because it's like the traversal of the fantasy, as I understand it, is to work through every element of the fantasy, not in the sense of, oh, my fantasy was X, Y, and Z. I wanted this. It's like not something that can be articulated.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the fantasy needs to be kept in some sense obscure, like it needs to be obfuscated, I think, in order to be operative, because otherwise it's like the fantasy is what allows the compulsion to repeat, to continue under the guise of it's like of a renovation of it all the time, of just like everything seems new all the time. Every day is a new day when you're just really replaying the fantasy again and again. The thing that always baffles me is like there's the fantasy that you actively daydream about, and then the fantasy that underpins your life. And those are, I feel like, two different things, but they are connected.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, yeah. Exactly.
I don't have an answer for that. I don't know what the relation between the two are, because there's unconscious fantasy and there's conscious fantasies, to put it
right.
simply.
But I think the conscious ones can come up into the unconscious as like day residues in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah. I could be wrong.
Mikey said something really interesting to me once that I never forgot, which is basically people are much more willing, no, eager even, to share the details of their dreams, but when it comes to the details of a person's daydreams, they keep those closely guarded and secretive. It's as if, in a sense, you're referring to two different subjects there. The subject of the daydream is supposedly you in your waking life making decisions for yourself. Therefore, whatever you're daydreaming about is embarrassing. Whereas the dream itself, we already, for the most part, there's this consensus that, oh, well, that's not exactly you. That's not something you have control over. So we can kind of laugh at it. We can take some distance from it. You know what I mean? And be like, isn't it weird that I had this dream? Isn't it weird that this happened? And yet there are times when it's like you could have a partner who's angry at you for having a dream where you did something, I don't know, where you were unfaithful. You could be the most unfaithful partner ever, but like, or you might not want to confess that fact, because then suddenly it's like your subjective involvement in the action of the dream is like under question suddenly.
Yeah.
Like suddenly it's like as if you're making these decisions for yourself.
That's good.
But
it's funny that we were getting into dreams, because then he talks about like when he says the child is the subject, there's no doubt about it. And then he mentions somebody's dream where it's like of a child, and it's like, well, the child is them, which I think is pretty interesting.
The turtle in the dream of or is that just a metaphor he uses, or did someone actually dream about turtles? Yeah, I
think, yeah, it's just like a dream about turtles.
He says that's the subject right there.
Right, yeah.
Which reminds me of what he says in Seminar 1 about the one element in the dream that is not necessarily a day residue, or if it is, it's like the thing that stands out, right? It's like the one anomalous piece of the dream that is the otherness of the body in some ways being represented. I'm wondering if there's any connection there. Remember, he says that like the alterity of the body, it's like in waking life, it's like because of this ego sort of synthesis, our thoughts and our bodies appear as just one continuous synthetic process, whereas in the dream the disconnect is more pronounced, and that it hinges on one detail, one element in the dream, that represents what happens in everyday life as more of like an immediate phenomenon. So I'm thinking the turtle might be that.
Right. And especially like if like, our like you say, it's not continuous. And the fact what we could even call a continuous body is always a misrecognition, because we're talking about a fragmented image. But even then it's like, that's how we would try to view ourselves, maybe consciously, but like, I think unconsciously, there's always like this sort of fixation on the mapped body, the partial objects, and in relation to other partial objects too, that are not necessarily the body, but what those parts of the bodies enjoy, or even fear. Maybe I don't know. It's something to kind of play around with.
Like that game that people play when they're younger, where it's like, hot and cold, you're getting colder, like you're trying to find an object, and it's like you're getting warmer, hot, like cold. It's kind of like that. I don't know why that came to mind, but that's sort of like mapping of desire. But all right, this is our ghost phase episode, because I feel like we're just,
well, it's good because there's a lot to play with. It's
I hope people, because like, I don't know, I don't try to censor myself as much as I do in everyday life when it comes to these conversations, so they go all over the place. So I don't know if that's frustrating for people or not, if they're like trying to approach these
line by line,
and this is where I'm like, well, someone who's really an expert would be like, they're not even focusing on the details of what he's talking about, but like I think we're circling it in the right way.
And the thing is like, I mean, we should be like, we're an analysis where we're saying whatever's on our mind, free associating.
Which is what he was doing, what I was doing himself. But I think, okay,
right here is interesting though, because when we talk about like though like everything with free associating and then resisting of the analysis, there's this thing that he emphasizes of how like with the ego, there's like a sum of the doxa as well, like the prejudices and attachments, and like the keyword he uses is like that give an equilibrium to the ego,
aka inherent biases. We all have them. There's nothing wrong with us. We just need to do a little inventory with the help of some HR training. No, that's not what he's saying at all.
No, it's a lot deeper. Think of it like as imagine of like right, you see this of like somebody who is not only a devout Christian in the belief, but it's a part of their identity. So imagine they have a tragic accident or something happens in their life and God wasn't there. Now that's like a disequilibrium to their identity. And literally it's like they have to renounce God, or they're just in this like crossroads of like, do I still maintain faith or do I just disavow God? And walk like a godless path pretty much. And in that sense, it's like that's what would be meant by attachments and prejudices. That's like not just, it's like, that's like, I would like to think I'm more of like this. It's like, no, it's like really like what structures your ego, not just these like quick like, if I had to think about like, what my beliefs are. No, like, it's something that even when you're not believing, it's believed for you in a sense.
Right. And then that's where we can bring fantasy back into it, in as much as the inscription of, let's say, this traumatic event into an ego encompassed view of the world becomes a way of like, well, one, obfuscating it, keeping it hidden, and two, repeating it while maintaining that cohesion of the different parts of the ego. But there are things that will disrupt that to such a degree that it becomes a problem.
Right.
It becomes a problem of fantasizing almost, I would say.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that even with fantasy, right, as I think Zizek says, it's like fantasy is the scene where the ego learns to desire. It teaches itself how to desire, and desire is that which is structured like a language, because it's of the unconscious. So in a sense, you do learn how to structure your drives and aims through fantasy and the way you metaphorize it.
Fantasy is a kind of interpretation. You know, what's interesting is like, even if you think about Kant's idea of judgment, there's almost ideology built into it because just the identification of the thing involves a kind of judgment. And fantasy as something that schematizes what we experience and involves a kind of a form of judgment, and that works for us up until the point that it doesn't.
Right.
And fantasy needs to be revamped in a sense.
I think that's why Zizek is like has that Kantian element, and why his first book is called The Sublime Object, because it's very much Kantian, you know.
Yeah.
The what was it that which makes distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, or something like that.
Right, because the sublime, like, yeah, the beautiful has to do with like the almost like a kind of synchronous order to things, one more Platonic in that sense, because it's like for Plato, I think the beauty of mathematics surpasses the beauty of any kind of representational art. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that Plato has the same conception of the divine in that, or the sublime, because the sublime is that which it's like the seams of reality itself come apart, and you see the limits of representation. And the example that Kant uses is sort of like, all right, you have the beauty of, I don't remember what example he uses for beauty, but let's say flowers, I think maybe is what it's like. Okay, actually, I can't uphold that. I don't know like how flowers are beautiful. So
right.
Flowers are aesthetically beautiful, but like it's the storm versus flowers, I think is what he says. It's like,
right,
the storm is sublime. It's not like, you wouldn't be like, wow, like you wouldn't be looking like you like, okay, let's say you're a tornado hunter or whatever, you know, those people that like follow storms and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know that they would say, oh wow, that tornado is beautiful. I think they would find it more to be sublime, and that it's like the awe-inspiring fear of dusting. The thing itself is like what tests the limits of representation in a certain way.
I want to take it in a different direction.
Yeah, go for it.
And say that, well, the flowers are beautiful, but the sublimity of the flowers is the way that it functions in the act of, like, you know, when you're, you know, on your first date and you give the date flowers, and the way that they react, it creates the scene of sublimity. It's just like of love.
Yeah, but I think the sublime for Kant has more to do with fear, though. It's like the thing.
Is it?
Yeah, because it strikes fear in your heart when you see.
Oh,
it's
that's
like the
true.
surge. It's like the surge of the wave. The thing is, it's like, if you have the beauty of like geometry, for example, is the beauty of something that's inert and static, versus like the surge of a wave is something that kind of tests the limits of phenomenal representation. You see what it is, but it's all inspiring. It heaves, it falls, it breaks, it swells. It's like that, and that creates a kind of terror because you see the advent of the thing in itself, in a sense. Now, but Zizek doesn't agree with that idea of like, oh well, it represents another plane of experience. But you know, in a sense, the sublime belongs to the very phenomenal experience that
Right.
we have, but we don't have to get to that level. What I think is interesting here, just to bring it back to the text, is that he says how what we were just talking about interpretation and fantasy. It's like knowing at what level the answer should be pitched. So
Right.
it's like the interpretation that you offer to the analysan it has nothing to do with the exact knowledge that you're imparting to them in a didactic way, but rather has to do with the timing of it, because it's like you already have an interpretation of everything you experience. Once those interpretations begin to degenerate, once the fantasy itself begins to degenerate, loses its efficacy, then the analyst's role is to offer interpretation at the right time that attacks the materiality of that fantasy, in a sense. Do you think that's right? Or
Yeah, yeah. I see where you're going with that.
that reveals the cuts
Right.
in the ego in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
what the fantasy had been mobilized to enable the subject to avoid, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's where the resistances, lie, right? And what's being resisted, and like you'll find the traces of the unconscious of the real, right? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
good.
yeah. And that's the beauty of, you just picture Lacan eating his cake or whatever, ending his sessions early.
Right.
Someone says something, and I maybe it's at the point of demand, a way of subverting demand in a way that totally frustrates the analysis. And it seems like such an insult, and that was such a slap in
Right.
the face to have the session end at that moment. But it's like the interpretation is not, oh well, guess what? You want to kill your father. You want to
Right.
fuck your mother. It's kind of like the interpretation could be as simple as like, well, you already said
Right.
what it is you want. Maybe it's an enigmatic statement. Session's done. I'm left with the fragments of everything I just said up until this point, and therein is revealed like the incoherence of the ego.
Right. And I think that's funny too, like, look like picturing Lacan, eating his cake or loudly counting coins, sipping on tea really loud, is like at these moments is where there is structuring of the fantasy of a patient, especially if they're free associating about it. But like, what if it's like in that moment, like they're kind of getting more like lost in it and getting jouissance from being nostalgic about this fantasy, or like if it's the past, right? Or like just going on and on. It's like almost like they're masturbating. And so it's like his way to interrupt that is like giving them like, in a sense, blue balls, pardon my French.
Yes.
But it's just like the fact that he's able to do that. It's just like, it's not the fact that, you're constructing this fantasy, but at what point are there gaps? And like the reaction to that tells you something.
Yeah, there's the problem is it's sort of like everything in ego psychology becomes essentially maternal, and the dynamic becomes maternal, and it's like you're providing a nourishment that wasn't provided at a decisive point in the patient's history, but that only reinforces the enjoyment, and it's the subversion of enjoyment that's supposed to happen. So, like at the end of Good Will Hunting, when I'm not saying Robin Williams is a bad analyst necessarily in that role, but when he's like, it's not your fault. I always thought, oh, that's a really touching scene and everything, but it's like from the point of view of psychoanalysis, that wouldn't be the best solution to address the main character's symptom, because it only like allows them to, like, he reacts kind of angrily. Matt Damon's character cries, and then he breaks down and they hug, and it's like this beautiful moment. But it's like, oh, okay, so Robin Williams in that situation is the parental figure that he never had, and then the love that is offered in that moment becomes replenishing and nourishing. But it, it him getting angry, him crying, him going through this whole series of emotions, and then having Robin Williams indulge him in that state really only reinforces the enjoyment that he's experiencing.
Yeah.
And that is not what the analyst does. The analyst has to be, well, I don't know for sure, but like maybe not cold necessarily, but there's a general coldness. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah,
Oh,
especially
like
like
in the systematic avoidance of demand.
right, and especially you have to be that way for perverts because you can't react in a way that's like either giving into their demands or um you know being the law, right, saying like no you can't do that, especially with like how perverse somebody could be, especially sexually, um right, and that kind of thing will strike a chord, and perverted, well, having a perverted patient and like the things that they do and they express about in their fantasies, like it could strike a chord in you. But if you're not cold and you react in a way, then it's like giving them jouissance to then transgress you.
It giving them jouissance is recognizing them in the exact guy under the exact guise that they've assumed.
Yes, yes. So
And
you're right to say that there is a coldness to it.
speaking of mothers, speech is mother to the misrecognized part of the subject. I really like
Right. Yeah, that part struck the chord too.
that's bars right there.
Yeah.
Um,
because not only is the misrecognition coming from like the lure of the image, but also and how you're situated with the image, the optical schema, right? uh and what he was talking about in like seminar one is like mathematically being situated, right? But math is like a type of language, but we're talking about a language that situates us in our everydayness and how we see ourselves and mirror ourselves with others. So it's like it's the language is holding this misrecognition.
and it's funny because we always talk about now in our society, it's sort of like with the breakdown of certain roles, in and they should be broken down, and I'm all for it, but it's sort of like critique of the patriarchy, what would come to replace the power dynamics that typify the patriarchy would be communication, right? Like a healthy relationship between two people is one where there's like a lot of communication, right, where needs and wants and fears and everything is communicated, is verbalized in a way where the idea would be that would lead to a greater understanding of one's partner and a greater, like in a sense, territorialization of the unknown,
Right.
out there, to the point where my partner is fully colonized for me and I am fully colonized for them, and then we really fuse into one. This is the ideal. But like the issue is that what this is all about is non-communication, is like uh, communication also in the sense of like two things being contiguous. Speech,
right.
the decenterment here is where you want the subject to feel alienated from what their own speech, from what from the materiality of their own speech, not to feel like it means so, like I'm going to guarantee an even higher meaning of it, like it's already, I'm not, this is what the recognition piece comes in, where we were talking about before. It's like in society, in everyday life, among people at work, by my partner, friends, I don't feel recognized, they don't hear me,
right,
I need
right.
someone to hear me. And then the analyst is going to be that person who's like, no, I hear you. It's like the opposite. It's kind of like, no, I'm trying to like
Yeah.
unhinge you from your own speech so that you're decentered in relation to it in a way that it becomes foreign to you, it becomes unfamiliar. That's where the symptom is.
Exactly. And look at like the homie Ballant with the one dude, God bless our homie Ballant, our brother in Christ, when literally that's like how that patient was. Like he wants somebody to hear him, and like, they're all bullshitting him because, they're just like, yeah, yeah, I hear you, I see what you're saying. And it's not working. And then like Ballant's just like, I I'm trying to listen to what you're saying. I just can't make anything of it. He's just like, my God, you're a genius.
You're actually listening to me because I'm like, in that sense, that the patient's a genius because he's pointing to the fact that there is this disconnect between speech and the subject.
Right,
And
right.
he's like exploiting that because your typical, psychotherapist is going to, be an ally, be a friend. It's just,
Mhm.
I mean, it is a default role also in everyday life. So it's like,
Right.
that's what's to be avoided here. And it's like the issue, of course, is that, and this is where ideology comes in, and what he's saying here, that the normalization of the individual is always part and parcel of ego psychology and the development of the healthy ego, because it's like health as a goal becomes completely caught up in social structures
Hmm.
as they exist, even though one of the promises of therapy as a signifier or as a culture is that it offers some sort of like bastion outside of that, which people imagine it's like, all right, let's stop talking about politics. Let's stop talking. You're hung up on ideology because you're enacting some other kind of relation to your trauma, or
Hmm.
you have, as if like it just being obsessed with ideology is that, well, that's like symptomatic in the more generic sense, but it's like, no, that this therapy culture is not this sanctified space outside of ideology and
Right, right,
capital.
right.
In fact, it is maybe in many ways the most um like it's the most purified expression of that
Right.
kind of culture, even though you would think, well, oh, well, what about conservative Christian culture and everything? It's like people raised in the church, they're the most indoctrinated, like that's the thing I'm trying to escape. And thank God that I found this nice, like sanitized clinical reality that
Right.
exists outside of that space. It's like that's what's so elusive, is that like, no, you just went from one church to another.
Right, exactly. And the fact of like, yeah, they're both institutions, and like the, you know, D&G sense of, uh, it acts as an apparatus, even like an Althusserian sense of like ideological reproduction. Well, for D&G, they wouldn't use the term ideology, but it's part of restructuring the codes of flow, desire, capitalism in, the schizophrenic and stuff like that. And it's also funny because like there's always this notion in therapy culture where like it's like a safe space, be able to say what you want, but there is no confidentiality, at least 100%. And like it always makes you think of those memes. It's like my therapist calling the cops after explaining all my trauma and stuff, like, and everything that I think about. But like right then and there shows you, like, at least like on a base and superstructure level, that the therapy is pretty much ideological, but in the sense of just on like the level we're talking about with psychoanalysis, there's censorship and there's still a law that the therapist tries to uphold and be, and therefore like it never gets to the unconscious, because it reproduces this master slave dialectic. And that's one thing that we have to try to at least like avoid in like the countertransference of reproducing this, as in a sense, either giving ground relative to the patient's desire, or well, yeah, for the most part that, but like just trying to think of us as lawgivers pretty much,
I like that. Yeah, exactly.
because that's what therapy culture does, especially like they make it PC. what language can I use so I don't trigger you, right? We should use words like this, because, oh, what you're doing is you're black and white thinking. With CBT, for instance, it's like your automatic thought is to assume this. Well, maybe the automatic thought is not because of this, but there's like an underlying desire for the automatic thought, or this neuroses that like makes people automatically want to like prohibit themselves from enjoying because of this guilt.
I like that idea. You don't want to be a lawgiver, but it's sort of like, yeah, and you're setting up an entire apparatus in the Althusserian sense, even when you succumb to the demand of the patient who's saying, don't say these certain words, like I need this space territorialized just so in order to flourish.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, it becomes this artificial space where it's like the unconscious simply never addressed. It'll never come to the fore.
Right. It's our new thing, Althusserian in the clinic.
That sounds like a great title for a book, honestly. For real.
Yeah, I would consider myself some type of Althusserian Lacanian, because that's really where like my Marxist thinking comes, is more from Althusser.
Yeah,
this is definitely like the go-to with base and superstructure and ideology.
oh, for sure. I think I mean, we both agree that that's the best portal into Marx, and that's that's not a very popular opinion at all. Most people write him off.
Right.
But when it comes to the intersection of psychoanalysis and Marx, who's the
right
to really exploit that in a good way, not to
this right this right here, we get into some heavy waters right here, because then when he's talking about the dream, right, and really he says that in the interpretation of dreams, Freud discusses that there's an ontological meaning or status to aspect of what would be called the core of our being, right? And I thought that was pretty interesting. And I wonder if it's very similar to like, what is it called? The navel of the dream. But what, no, you've heard of that?
I remember him mentioning that. Yeah, the navel of the dream.
Yeah. And right here is like the core of our being is not like some thing of like, oh, at the center, this is who we actually are, like some substance, cogito. What it is more of like what we get at is something of like maybe the subject in question, or what it's called, the pathogenic nucleus, right? That's what it's actually referring to.
Yeah, the point at which it's sort of like the chain of signifiers, or the many chains of signifiers, let's say balled together like rubber bands, right. That's like the core. There's a core to it, I like the image of a rubber band ball, because it's like first it's just like a bunch of rubber bands that don't really hold together, and then like the more you put, it's like, and then after it becomes a ball, you imagine there's a core to it. But there really is no core. It's just a bunch of rubber bands.
Exactly.
That's the core of the being, is like it's only like postulated as something that needs to exist in order for a ball to exist, but it's a retroactive thing.
Yeah.
And this is where the core of our being does not coincide with the ego. So now he's going to get into how we can deconflate moi and I without just reinstituting the I as just like everything our everyday notion of the ego isn't. Because it's like, what's interesting is that like people who haven't studied psychoanalysis still have this idea of ego. It's just like, oh man, that's just your ego talking. Like when you're selfish or like display narcissistic behavior, or get offended at something, people will say, "Oh, that's all ego. I had to get past my ego in order to help other people." Even that's like a misrecognition of a misrecognition in a sense.
Right.
That people still have this notion of ego as not you.
Yeah,
But he's saying that's still just reduplicating
exactly. Because it's like the
the
ego is
ego.
not you, but at the same time, there's something else that's you, and then you literally just like have made an ego out of that.
Or like when people will say, oh, like I had spent my entire life chasing this dream or like becoming an athlete or trying to win an Academy Award or whatever, and then I did it, and then I was left with myself, who am I when I'm not doing these things that I didn't know? So then, but like the solution usually in that scenario is to like further explore your inner contents. Like, who am I
Right.
when I'm not shooting hoops, or like when I'm not writing in my case, and as if there's someone else I am. There's another little me inside the me that I am, and then it's like an endless series of Russian dolls, basically.
Right.
It's like
Like Lacan said, like in the context of Anna Freud and like the Anna Freudian school of thought of the little man within the man.
exact,
And
yeah, the little
yeah,
man within the man. Yeah,
and you can see like another example with like new ageism and alternative spirituality. What's like that's just your, like you said, like that's just your ego talking. Don't listen to your ego. Your ego is gonna breed you with illusions, and like it's all about doing this meditation to clear your mind, and then like you know then you'll find your true self pretty much, right? Have an ego death, like, or even like psychedelic bros saying like, bro, I'm just trying to have an ego death. And so it's like, no, you don't. You just create, let's say like use the three registers. You just kind of twisted the knot in a weird way with the imaginary, right? And it really disoriented the symbolic. So like that's why you're able to come with creative things and stuff like that. But it's not an ego death, right?
you still want an insurance policy in place that you will be reconstituted as you after your ego death. If it was
Right.
ego death, a death, from my understanding, is like pretty permanent.
Yeah.
So it's like you'd think ego death you'd stay dead, but like you only want to do that so long as like your ego bounces back. Otherwise, it would be a fucking nightmare,
Exactly.
So it's like, yeah, no, how about you ego die permanently, like, and see if that's an attractive thing. But you're gonna come back and like, people, it's like, I've undergone ego death, man, and then like try to like lecture people on
Yeah.
what they should eat, what they should or shouldn't eat, or something like,
Right.
what I mean? It's like, all right, dog.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's why we hate Western Buddhists.
Western Buddhist bros. Alan Watts simps. We are the universe observing ourselves, so said the narcissist.
Yeah. Exactly. Where did I see a good meme about that recently? That was like about the universe observing itself. Um, yeah, but you think that ego is nothing but incomplete, erroneous form of
Right.
this I, and then it's like, but he calls it. I had to look this up. Diplopia is just like double vision.
Oh yeah.
So it's just like that moment where you're cross-eyed and then you uncross-eyed, like you, and the two images come together.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, pretty much you've gotten nowhere
Yeah, exactly, right.
by
Because
doing this.
that
Yeah.
seems like that's what like the ego psychology tries to do, is restore like unity. It's like, oh, we found this back, and like now you could be your like normal ego self again, which is always still put into question, like the um determination of analysis, and like when does it end, and like the question of the cure, right? Because it's like if your ego is destined to failure, then after going into the unconscious and understanding the structures, and then like the symptom, um, what comes next? Because obviously the ego is a misrecognition. I think for the most part, we're gonna have, I guess, the ego no matter what. but it's not going to be in a, I guess, more misrecognized aspect where it breeds like I guess desire toward failure in a undermining way. It's definitely something that's just puzzling, just because of the fact it's like ego psychology tries to strengthen the ego, right?
Right, because it's like,
And CBT, right? It's not like it doesn't have no notion of the ego at all. It's just we will use the term ego in like a nonchalant sense, right? It just becomes another buzzword. And
and
so
that,
like CBT is not ego psychology, but the way it functions, it tries to strengthen your thoughts and make you more understanding of your emotions so you don't, commit those behaviors. So it kind of functions in the same way like ego psychology.
well, he's going to
Yeah.
critique behaviorism, and
Yeah.
could you just replace behaviorism with CBT?
Yeah, because
Update it,
CBT,
yeah.
yeah, CBT is behaviorism.
Where they're like, we're gonna, well, you know what? We're gonna dodge the issue altogether. We'll
Right.
bypass it by just observing your behavior, as if that solves the problem.
Yeah, and it's just like on a what like then behavior becomes like a meta language because you got to ground like what by definition is behavior. Not only that, but like then you condition them to behave in a certain way that's deemed morally valid, but in what regards? Only in relation to society, right?
You might feel a little bit better. You might have
Yeah,
better ways of dealing with your anxiety, but anxiety is also a message.
right, right.
It's sort of, you could think of it as trying to tell you something. So to eliminate it altogether is, well,
Hmm.
to, you know,
Yeah.
be
Hmm.
an opiate,
Right.
you know. Um, Shout
Because
out
like
to
with,
opiates
with
though.
with addiction, right? Because even like with addictions, it's like yeah, it's a behavior of constantly, doing something like trying to get the same thrill, whether it's like sex addiction, drug addiction, substance abuse.
Yeah.
But really, like even if you get rid of the behavior of doing that, the jouissance of compulsion to repeat will come into some other sense, constantly bouncing back and forth. And I used this before, like people that get off of heroin and or meth, right? They got away from that drug addiction, they got away from that narcotic, but they don't know anything else to do, and they pick up drinking habits more, and then they become an alcoholic, which becomes far worse than drug addictions. And I've seen this a lot in like the hood, like people in the hood like that stop doing dope, stop doing meth, and then they become really bad alcoholics. And
Yeah.
they, yeah, and it's like, well, have you like, and I'll say, it's like, have you just tried smoking weed? Like, I can't smoke weed; it gets me paranoid.
Well, everyone needs that like numbing agent.
Right, right. And I think to a certain extent, like Gabor Mate kind of like gets to a point, but then like he really doesn't because he's not really, a psychoanalytic thinker. And he says it's like not the substance, like or the behavior, right, of addiction, but why the pain,
Right.
like the wound. So I think, but like he's focused more on like that affective plane without realizing it.
Without realizing there's always a signifier underpinning the
Right, right,
affective plane,
right.
which is like, well, no, I won't get off on this tangent, but like that's really interesting what you were saying. But um, I like what he says here about how people thought that by analyzing the ego, one would find the reverse side of whatever it was that had to be made
Mm.
comprehensible. This like inversion or reverse side of the
Right.
ego, because it's like, as it when he says the ego is a misrecognition, it's not like this idea, oh, it's a bad thing. This is what the homie Becker said to us once. It's like, actually, he thinks that everything in analysis actually does take place within the frame of the ego, within the register of the ego. In some ways, it's like, because this could all too quickly be interpreted as like a clearing away of the ego in favor of what's really going on.
Right,
And
right, right.
like that, I think that the ego is always present. It's never done away with.
No, and like what it is like the like misrecognition and like the whole optical schema or the mirror stage is the point of alienation. And so it always comes back to Hegel of like you'll never get reconciliation or totalization. You're always going to have that split, which is alienation, right? it just could be alienation is creative, and even Sartre brings this up too. It's like, you know, the negativeness of of subjectivity. In a point, in some points, he's dealing with alienation with the phenomenology of being and nothingness, and that we're always like have this radical freedom that's more of like not just like a blessing, but also a curse that takes a lot of responsibility. Um, but not to get too lost in phenomenology of existential. But I think that like existentialism, I think that's a really good point. Um, and bringing up the whole thing about this reverse side, ego psychology does this, yes, but like this is giving me like Jung vibes because Jung and the psycho, like the analytic psychology, are ego psychology as well. The averse side of the ego being the shadow, right? And that's what they're trying to look at. Of course, there you have the unconscious and they're dealing with dreams, but they really see like the shadow as containing like something that, you know, must be incorporated to make the ego, you know, better than what it was.
I like the metaphor of the shadow. I don't necessarily like what they want to do with the shadow, though.
Yeah.
Again, with like what you're saying about Gabor Mate, it's like coming so close to a really important insight, and then it's sort of like what Lacan was saying before about people, you know, like just not being able to assimilate all of the consequences of a true
Right, right,
of a
right,
really powerful insight, because they kind of shy away from it because
right. Okay, okay. So now section two is really heavy on getting at like the phenomena of consciousness. And just to kind of like elaborate, and we could look at this like phenomenologically too, like where when we think of like the consciousness or like even like the ego, um, you know, the whole thing that original phenomenology was like is that consciousness is conscious of something. And this literally is the exact opposite of what the Freudian experience shows, that the ego is not necessarily a given, or it's not whole or like an object in the way that we see other objects. And at the same time, we treat it as such. But because of the project of Freud and realizing the decentering of the ego, it leads to a question like the seems like in this section, like Lacan wants to show is like not necessarily how the ontology of consciousness is, but rather it functions, and it seems like um, the phenomenon that allows it to be, if that makes sense,
right.
or
It's
allows it to function.
because we have different ideas of consciousness, and I, again, like I'm not the most well read when it comes to Heidegger, but I feel like we're kind of dealing with two different ideas of consciousness here. The Heideggerian one, where it's like you're saying, it's phenomenological. We need to investigate consciousness through its localizations. Philosophy hasn't done this yet, and this is kind of like the like logical endpoint to the Kantian project in a sense. Now that's like one approach to it. Then there's the cogito, like that's kind of opposed to the cogito, as I understand, which is kind of like what we were talking before, empty it of all contingencies,
Right, 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 right.
purely non-phenomenological, even though there is a kind of phenomenological kernel there, which is consciousness is appearing to itself. We can rest on those laurels.
Yeah.
Once we get to that point, we're good, we're safe. Now we can rebuild things. Lacan doesn't want to do either of those exactly. He wants to show, I think, sort of um
Right,
the cut between those two. Do you think
right,
that's
right.
correct?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Because he's not a phenomenologist and he's not a philosopher
No,
either.
no, no, definitely not. But I think he, in a sense, does pull from the two. But yeah, He wants to like maybe even go beyond like this notion of consciousness as like no matter what having this like substantial aspect to it or abstracting it from like its function in the phenomenon. He doesn't want to do that.
Right. Because he's not describing what it's not describing consciousness's relationship to its object necessarily, like how it is suffused, how it suffuses its object purely, but he's not also trying to get to a point where it's like we can isolate consciousness from
Right.
phenomena either.
It's not a philosophy of mind at
It's
all.
not a philosophy of mind, and that's what he's trying to point out. Yeah. And that's why I think what he's saying is more difficult than either of those theories that he's um, bypassing, or not bypassing, like what he's trying to distinguish himself from. It's challenging, and it has something to do to me with what he says about the rainbow as a in seminar one as a purely subjective phenomenon that has no
Right. Right. And because with like with Freud, right, it's like this like trying to create like a biological understanding or at least like biological metaphors to understand the phenomenon that's going on with like the ego resistance and trauma repetition, all these things. And yeah, that's like a good point to start off with, going over the notion of like how the image of a rainbow, we thought that it was subjective, but objectivity of this image now exists because we can take pictures of it so that it no longer is any doubt in the way that we function. Like people will still say, oh, well, we don't actually see a rainbow, right? Or these color, like, we'll say that like the color is like subjective or whatnot, or like physicists will say like really color or light doesn't exist in the way we think about it or perceive it, but that's entirely not the case, right? Or at least we're not in that. It doesn't matter, that's irrelevant. What matters is the fact of like the way that something that appears subjective or can be grounded in a subjective experience now functions materially through apparatuses that could capture images that would be taken as just purely like from personal experience. And I kind of think it's kind of similar to like, obviously image is different from sound, but they say like if a forest falls, or if a tree falls in a
That's what I was
forest,
going to say. Yeah.
nobody's there to see it. Did it, it really happen, or did it make a sound? And it's like, well, like you could record it, right? There could be like a recording there, like maybe like it's just a magical camera or something that records it, and like yeah, I kind of lost what I was gonna say. Oh, it's the fact that we have things that what he wants to get as a act as mirrors. Because if there is an ontology to his understanding of consciousness, it's a phenomenon that's grounded materially and it is materialistic, but it interacts in a way that is always trying to find recognition, right? And mirror itself.
What's trying to mirror itself? Consciousness, or
Yeah.
because it wants, again, that's like the recognition piece of it, right? It's like same with
Mhm.
knowledge wants to be acknowledged as, so acknowledged, like it wants to be acknowledged as such. Consciousness wants to be acknowledged as such, so it's not enough that there's just a pure receptivity. The idea of the transcendental apperception is that there's the apperceptive element of it, and then there's the transcendence is, I posit myself as the thing in the world receiving the images, the stimuli that I am receiving. So it would be a lot simpler if we were just purely receptive, but then we wouldn't have, well, philosophy or ask these questions. The fact that there's a
Exactly.
questioning being is always the problem. But again, like that's not even exactly what Lacan is concerned with, the status of the questioning being, which is what, you know, Heidegger is concerned with, right? Isn't like Dasein is that which questions its own,
Yeah.
is it
Yeah.
is what
What?
constitutes Dasein,
Yeah.
its own self-questioning. That's what distinguishes it as a being.
Yeah. Being that questions its own being, or has being as its concern, is definitely what Dasein is, and a concern in a world of beings, and the world and worldlyhood being as well.
But that's not like, Lacan's not trying to situate
Uh, no,
Dasein like in this way.
I wouldn't think so. Because he's not focused on necessarily being, but you could still see it as consciousness for him being in the world and operating in a way where it is recorded and mirroring and like the function of its image and the relationship between image and the ego. And it's making me think of, like, how you're saying, and where we were just talking about, like, the subjective experience then becoming more objective because it's recorded and captured, is almost like the notion of like a value or capital having this like subjective notion, but then it actualizes itself in the commodities and the way it mirrors itself in other commodities. And so now it has material concrete existence.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's yeah. And the flip side of that is what Zizek often points out, which is that people will say, like, yeah, you're right, capitalism is bad. They'll admit, yeah, we're part of this terrible machine. The system is terrible. We're all terrible. But you know what? Even if I'm not part of it, it's going to operate on its own, because it like reifies capital in the sense that it's like as if it's like this truly living being. But it's only through the belief in the believer of
Right.
capitalism that it is able to operate. If everyone did stop believing in it, it would cease to exist. But we treat it as if it has an existence independent of us.
Right. And that goes like the same with like even like the symbolic order and this function of speech and language and all that. Like people will be like, oh, at the end of the day, words are meaningless, or it's like it's just like a bunch of like, flesh in our throat like vibrating until we make a sound and just agree that it's useful.
Right. That's not what the theory of the signifier is either. Like where that, as if no, because it again, it goes back to like, what does it mean to know something? Does knowing something immediately result in a change of behavior? No, more often than not, it doesn't. That's why the
Yeah.
whole liberal worldview of like, we need to spread awareness,
Right.
like is it we're hyper aware of everything all the time.
Right. And
It
and
does
and
nothing to
that's
change it.
right. Right. Because people like, especially like with like liberal activism in the form of like, let's like talk about like one of the biggest ones, veganism, right? It doesn't change Americans' mind, like, that yeah, like there are a bunch of like cattle that are just like, in a slaughterhouse, and they're getting fed with different types of steroids and other antibiotics to keep them healthy and alive, and to mass produce more chickens or more cows and stuff, and yet they still eat it, right? These performative stunts to bring like awareness to the cruelty of the meat industry. Yeah, we know it and we're hyper aware of it because we can probably find any other vegan ad or vegan alternative, but people still are eating meat, right?
Right. And it's sort of like, because when we say, just to bring it back to the main thread here, it's like, because when we talk about these things, when we admit to a certain degree of fetishistic disavowal, then
Right.
it really just redoubles that disavowal, and that like what
Right.
what seeking recognition is a kind of is like consciousness seeking recognition, where it doesn't, the content of what's being said really doesn't matter when what's at stake is the seeking of recognition in a sense.
What's funny about it, the double disavow is like, if you look at McDonald's, like the worst fucking fast food restaurant, like especially in America, like, they have exposed videos of like how the meat is not real, like the chicken nuggets aren't real, but like it's not even the fact that people are still eating it. what makes it even more ironic is the fact it's like now they have a sign at the door that says like warning, like our food is known to cause, cancerous, illness and other types of health, irregularities or whatever. That's right there, like right before you go and enjoy and eat, and you read it and you still go and eat.
Right, exactly. Whereas like no longer can you be like, this is a dated ass reference, but like Charlton Heston at the end of like Soylent Green, where he's like, Soylent Green is people, it's people, damn you. It's like they know it's people now,
Yeah.
and we're still eating it. So that that is what is really falling apart here, is not the idea that like we don't really know what's going on, and the motherfuckers that like leave Plato's cave and come back aren't like the people in the cave aren't hearing them. It's like, no, they are hearing them. The
Right.
shadows, the symbolic efficiency of the shadows is still functioning. What I like here, though, that he says something really interesting about Freud's psychophysical conception of intraorganic systems, and how it's like sort of this elaborate metaphor, and it doesn't account for consciousness.
Right.
And but that's not a fault of the system. It's like that's why it is so brilliant in a sense, is that Freud doesn't try to explain what consciousness is from a philosophical point of view.
Right.
It's not important. It's only important to the degree that Lacan, in order to define his three registers, feels the need to address what ego psychology purports to address, which is a problem of consciousness in a sense. And he's kind of saying it's not. He wants to sort of get rid of consciousness here, I think.
It seems like, yeah, this dirty term, because like even like when you look at brain science and neuroscience and all this, they still take up the word consciousness or mind in like one shape or form or another. And they try to ground it in biology or in the brain, right? We know that there is some relationship between thoughts and the brain, and the way we process information. But the thing that's a philosophical error on their part is the fact that they locate consciousness itself inside the brain. This is something that a philosopher, I forget his name, but I'll put it to you later. We'll drop it in the description. But it's neuromania is the thing, right? Is the term of those that want to ground like the whole or resolve the whole issue of mind body dualism by placing mind inside the brain, right?
Right.
Or like a consciousness, right? It's located inside the brain.
Or it's like on the other side of things, you have like the somatization of all consciousness, which is like what I feel like a lot of Western Buddhist bros are after, is that kind of like, well, I want to be fully located in my body,
right,
and not deal with the mind body dualism. And mind body dualism isn't like a popular thing to think about, because it's kind of like, oh, like you're a basic bitch if you're talking about mind body dualism in philosophy. But like split subjectivity is, well, it's different from that, because again, like Descartes doesn't have a notion of the unconscious, and it's like, all right, so all of these, like, I like this phrase, neuromania. It's like all these neuromaniacal thinkers are trying to like, it's always like, well, okay, Descartes might have been onto something, but did he ever think about this? Or like, this is where he's wrong about this. And then it's like, the issue is that like they're just falling into the same kind of dualism trap, in that there's no unconscious. And when you don't have a concept of the unconscious, then you don't have a concept of, you're missing something big, basically.
Right. And I think that also that is just like not even the fact that they don't have the unconscious, but the relating negativity of consciousness or self-consciousness in the Hegelian sense, right? They always take the mind or consciousness as a positive notion. Even if they have to ground it or try to locate it, they always give it like a determinative quality, and without realizing that any form of identity always negates itself, right?
What did you say before, like determinations that negate themselves, essentially?
Say that again.
I think you said it before about determinations that negate themselves.
Yeah, right? And that's like even like the Sartrean model of self-consciousness or consciousness is that, you know, it's negative, but even like this negativity annihilates itself, and the nothingness of consciousness becomes exteriorized in the world, in being in the world, and that's like a Heideggerian notion. But like, you know, we know that Sartre misunderstood Heidegger to an extent by making his project a humanism, but that's like besides the point. The point is like this fits perfectly with the psychoanalytic Lacanian model of consciousness, because I mean he's kind of does, but then he doesn't want to give like Sartre his cred for his subjectivity.
Says it right here.
You know?
The thetic consciousness from non-thetic consciousness.
Yeah.
He likes the distinction to a point, but once again, it's like he wants to forego any deeper analysis of the metaphysics of it because he doesn't want to get into metaphysics here.
Yeah. And really what it boils down to is like his notion is like just how it functions and structures itself, and it's functioning like a mirror. And I think to like kind of like again to like talk about like consciousness in any other ways becomes an ontology of trying to see subjectivity outside of like its conditions. Like again, we're abstracting it out and we make it like a meta language. It's like a presupposition of the world that it's in.
Exactly, because I like that. Yeah, trying to abstract it from its conditions so that the subjectivity would be able to apprehend itself as it is,
right?
in an unconditional sort of existence, which not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. And to be like Zizek'ing about it, it's like we always say that like Marx didn't have a you know, notion of subjectivity, or Marxism doesn't have a notion of subjectivity. And you know, even they'll say that like, oh yeah, you know, that's idealism. But Marx laid the blueprints for that. Just like he, you know, authors would say like, you know, he didn't have a solid theory of ideology, but he talks about false consciousness, or religion is the opium of the masses. And these are all blueprints, right? And we could see the form of value um, taking form in these commodities to now have a concrete understanding of how subjectivity relates itself to itself, not in just this contemplative philosopher on the couch, but in everyday functioning, and it's mirroring. And
Right.
we see it in our desire for the commodity, not because like we think the thing is useful, but because of, you know, what we don't have, that narrative that it will bring us. And it is only after then that we realize the quote unquote utility of it.
Exactly. And I think you make a really good point there, if I understand you correctly, which is that like instead of being one of these purely like abstract philosophy bros who believe that they can remain apolitical by only dealing with concepts and don't quite see what the efficacy in a philosophical sense, let's set aside critique of political economy, but the efficacy in a philosophical sense of Marxist theory, they're missing something really important, which is that the commodity is a ineradicable mediating lens, or a a mediating factor in how we view our own subjectivity. So it's like if you're interested in the concept of self-relating negativity in the Hegelian sense, then and want to carry that theory through to its conclusion and have it in any way bear on our immediate experience as subjects of modernity, of subjects of late capitalism, then you cannot afford to jettison the commodity as that central contingent material factor that determines our own self-related concept of ourselves. And that's, I think, one of the things that Marx is pointing out that is easy to miss. And like, but why also on the other hand, like for IMT bros, or like just like your Marxist Leninists, it's like they want to do away with the philosophical dimension of Marx, which is like, okay, the philosophical dimension is that like, no, there are all sorts of, as he puts it, theological niceties to the commodity, and that the commodity really is in many ways that like perfect encapsulation of the dialectic.
Exactly.
So you can't get rid of that from either end as much as you want to get rid of the problematic, traumatic kernel of it.
Right. Yeah. And even like with somebody like Guy Debord, right? Like I think it's perfect right here because we're talking about images and mirrors, and he's talking about the society of the spectacle. And the first seminar, we saw that speech is mediation in relation to the ego. And I think in some ways, the misrecognition of the ego via the fragmented body image it takes to be itself is also a mediation of how they try to understand consciousness. And so like you could see the image and images and how they function in society mediating us, like in the Guy Debord sense, where he says like we're not mediated by things but mediated by images, right? And then what Lacan says, like words, and I think in some way words do have a mirroring aspect to them. Like I think, for instance, like maybe like if you had somebody who was like a terrible parent that always saying like you're always going to be ugly or something like that, just kind of like degrades you. So like, you know, then when you hear that word and right, you mirror yourself in there, and lowering your self-esteem because you hear that language, right? And then it brings the echo of the voice behind it, the abstract voice in your head of whatever, of the paternal metaphor or the mother function, whatever, that authoritative figure, the super ego. But in the sense like images and words seem to mirror, or objects mirroring, because of course the language aspect does structure us in a sense, right? And when I was talking about like the issue of or not the issue, the description of the optical schema, and they mediate us, but I think at the same time, words and speech can also give us a focal point to identify with, right, and to mirror ourselves. And like how like people have like words that they just don't like for some reason, like the word like moist just takes off. It's like it interjects the symbolic order, their identity. It's almost like in a way abject does, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, you become aware of the symbolic order as such, just like all words are nouns, right? Like when you say I don't like the word moist, you think, well, like, oh, well, you don't like what it denotes.
Right.
But no, not necessarily that. You don't like the materiality of that word itself. And then like if you're gonna put that word into question, it's like the materiality of all signifiers comes is set in relief. And that like you kind of see the symbolic order, not for what it is, but in its arbitrariness, because maybe in another language, maybe you learn Spanish or something, and whatever the word for moist is in Spanish, you have no problem with it. It doesn't strike you in the same way. It actually sounds nice. So people will say like, oh, a word in Italian or French, it sounds so much nicer in that language. It's like, even for something like banal or boring, you think like, wow, that's the word in French for mud, or that's the word in Italian for mud. It's like, it sounds nicer.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is the materiality of it. But yeah, it mirrors some, like it's a mirror of something else suddenly. Yeah. And so he's more concerned with the concept of the mirror than he is in trying to fix consciousness in its essence,
Right.
And this is, like you were saying before, this is sort of how his take on the whole if a tree falls in a forest thing, that make a sound, which is, of course, if there isn't a subject there to experience it,
Yeah.
can the object be said to exist at all? And he's like, well, we've got cameras.
Yeah, he said we know that now because we got cameras and stuff like that. We know that images can be saved and captured, but and here's the thing though, it's like it doesn't mean that like, oh, the image is contained in the camera, which is the wrong thing. And this kind of like goes back to say like, oh, the consciousness or the mind or the soul is contained in the body. Like, no, and we even get that in Buddhism, like there's a no self. So it doesn't mean that you're absolutely nothing at all, rather, but it's like there's no containment, right, of a self like in us, even in like the what was it, the Upanishads talking about like if you broke down like I think like a lotus seed into like a million pieces, all you would find left is just nothing, not the containment of a lotus flower.
Right. And it's kind of
And
like that. That's why the ego is like a necessary mediator, though, too, is I think
right.
what you're saying. It's sort of like that's why it's not
Yeah.
what you're talking about in terms of like putting it into praxis, and that like the ego necessarily has to be there to allow anything to be. Misrecognition must be possible. But I think I
Right,
cut you
right.
off. I'm sorry. What were you saying?
No. That's just pretty much like, yeah. That's like that shows it. And like another like example is the fact it's like when we talk about signal and Wi-Fi and phones, it's like it's not contained. The Wi-Fi is not contained in this phone or in the laptop I'm in. Like I may lose the camera or like or my phone may break and maybe my laptop stops working. It doesn't mean that like Wi-Fi disappears. Wi-Fi is you know in pretty much everywhere now. But like even when we got rid of like the satellites, the Wi-Fi wasn't contained in there.
But just a minute though. The
Yeah.
ego is somewhere. It's in the
Yeah.
camera.
You'll tell me. That's what. Yeah. That's exactly where I was just getting at. He's like, you'll tell me. Just wait a minute. But there are mechanisms which allow the conditions of something like the ego to exist, just like the image in the camera.
It's like no, there's an eye in the camera in the sense it's like the 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 world is in a sense like preconditioned for the enjoyment, not in the Jewish senses, but like for the reception of the subject, but that doesn't mean there's any substance to
Exactly.
the subject.
Yeah. That's
And
what I'm
that
trying to get at.
and that the dilemma or the paradox there is what gives rise to the ego, I think.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like so, and here's where it gets interesting in this section is that he will compare the camera. Well, I'll call the camera a machine, right? And then make it analogous to the symbolic order in which it has those conditions to contain the ego, but the ego in a sense is not like it's not like oh, now we just found like the new mind body dualism, because we shouldn't see the ego as a substance, or rather an entire phenomenon put together and contained within the symbolic order of speech, language, alliances, kinships, all that Straussian, mumbo jumbo.
That's its imaginary function. And when we say imaginary, we mean image too.
Right,
That's the
right.
imaginary function.
Right.
The image is like, and this is what we're getting at. Hence the optical schema and the metaphor of the camera. It produces something, right? Optics, like we were saying, is the only science that produces something rather than reduces something. What it
That's good, yeah.
produces is like something whole, something that has the appearance of a kind of like wholeness or like a self-sufficiency of something existing on its own.
Right.
Really just the convergence of different points of light at a certain point. But it's like we need images essentially to mediate our experience. And even the transference is like imagistic in that sense, I would say. Like
Yeah, most definitely. And like you could think of it as um like the image of the analyst, like the analyst contains the truth of my ego or something like that. I don't know.
well, he says like if without the transference we're left with like a multiplicity of
Yeah.
whatever, but it's like it's not as if we're left with like a multiplicity that can be arranged. It's kind of like if you think about light, like light isn't a substance, but it's like light converges at a certain point to generate an image that would seem substantial.
Right. And that's like his whole use of this metaphor, and it makes more sense
When
than
you break
biology.
it down, there's not. It's like the same thing with the transference. Like it converges on a certain point. It seems like a
Hmm.
substantial mirrored image of one's ego, but it's not.
Right,
The point of the analyst is to be that kind, the a special kind of mirror that reveals the insubstantiality in the sense of like,
right. And like when you look at light, right? Look at the whole double slit experiment. It's like the does it behave like a particle or a wave? The whole photon, right? And it's like when it's measured, it behaves like a particle, and then when it's not, it behaves like a wave and goes to both. But then when they observe it, then it acts like a photon again, right? So like the observation of it, even outside of using like apparatuses, but actually observing like the eye, the relationship between the eye and light.
right. And it's kind of like an identity crisis of light
Right.
itself. And this is what Zizek says is that like, if like God created a universe, but God never expected us to be able to develop the tools to get to this point. So the excuse is kind of like, well, I didn't think you were going to
Yeah.
figure out how to do this. So I didn't like account for this. Like,
Mhm.
it's like a silly kind of metaphor, but it's kind of funny.
Yeah, no, it is funny. Yeah.
Um, I don't know. We should probably like wrap up because
Yeah,
I'm
we're getting close to
but
the
there's
main
some
thing
great
though is
stuff
like
though here about like anthropomorphism. And oh yeah, I want to talk about what he talks about here because he's like, again, going back to leading God in through the back door. Again, it's sort of like he says that, look, we don't want to have to resort to a terminal, like the terminus of God as like the like in the Augustinian way that he was
right.
referencing before. But he's like, but also there's an anthropomorphism in scientism, scientific atheism, because it's like consciousness then becomes God
Right.
in a way. It turns I love this metaphor. It turns two absolute king into a constitutional one. So where you think
Right.
like, oh well, there's like the king that is just the medieval monarch who is just seen as like a descendant of God or like a vassal of God. That's such a prehistoric way of thinking. That's such a backwards way of thinking. But we have a constitutional monarch who also must obey the laws of the Constitution and is only the vessel of those laws. It's like, well, it's still a king.
Yeah.
And your consciousness, which is law abiding, which is Newtonian or whatever, still has all of the features of God in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Because what he calls it like epiphenomena, right? Which is
Yep.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Like what comes with this definition of consciousness, which develops along the lines of like the analysis of phenomena, or they just, again, the conceit of a completely disinterested, dispassionate, observational eye of science. There's an epiphenomenal train that's also running alongside.
Yeah, most definitely there is. And he's definitely not doing that. If anything, it's consciousness is like a less than nothing. And but there's like it's a dialectic of it, like and this nothingness annihilates itself, and we'll never get to what the core of consciousness is in like the way that like science bros want to take it up. Um, and then like they're like, could this mean that we do have a soul, or was Descartes right? Like, and all this stuff, like trying to like just repeat the errors of philosophy just in the name of science. Um, it's all this like positivistic, analysis, and never seen like uh the error or really the repetition of failure, the dialectical aspect of what we could call consciousness or subjectivity, and the fact that all these people will pretty much make a meta language out of their discourse.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Or their commentary becomes a meta commentary.
Right.
It becomes it establishes itself on the basis of its own legitimacy, whereas it like defines its legitimacy as being derived from the force of its observations being held together, when in reality it like surreptitiously defines another ground of its own
Right.
statements.
And it also kind of funny too when like the whole transhumanism movement came about, like the whole thing about like, oh, we the more we learn about AI and computers, the more we will learn about the brain, and then we could have like, an AI equipped to us, like all these like weird like, Michio
Yeah.
Kaku bros and all this stuff, like this weird like fetishism of being like half human, half robot.
Yeah. Well, because and there's no theory of desire there. Is it?
Yeah,
There's only a theory that like you'll know what you want and it'll be so. And it's like you're missing the great
right.
insight of psychoanalysis then. I
Yeah.
like what he says here. There's a little demon inside the embryo.
Right.
He has such a funny way of like putting things, which is funny because like when we get off on our flights of fancy with like just trying to um gain the limelight for ourselves, as he puts it, he also he finds like little silly ways of
Right.
encapsulating like everything we're talking about that
Right.
I really
And
like.
I again he's like criticizing behaviorism.
Right. So
All
this is like,
yeah.
yeah, this is CBT shit,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
As for us, we're going to observe total behavior. We're not going to pay attention to consciousness. Yeah, it's like they only want to look at behavior and like not anything about like, not everybody's a Lacanian, right? So we could be object relational bros. We could be typical Freudians of the so with object relations like the fetish, the fantasy, the splitting of the ego and as a defense mechanism, or we could be Freudians and talk about like the unconscious fantasy, the unfulfilled wish that keeps coming up in dreams, all this stuff, and even dreams themselves, like they never get taken into account in a behaviorism or just even science at all. It's just like, oh, it's just REM, or it's just like chemicals produced in your brain, and this is like the epiphenomenal reaction. And it's kind of like a straw man, my usual like straw man, but there's a point to that, there's a point to the fact that it is a common discourse. No matter how articulate I can make the argument, that's the common discourse of science of consciousness or philosophy of mind, right? It's
Yeah,
always on the conscious level.
I think that's one straw man that um definitely like coincides with a lot of like actual men.
Right. No,
Like
yeah, no,
there
but
are
like
people that think that shit. Like whenever you think like, oh yeah, like nah, I want to be fair. I'm like creating a straw man. It's like no, like there are plenty of people that like totally coincide with that straw man and their viewpoint. You know,
right. Like, and scientists are very like the biggest culprits of this. Like, we're just this, we're just that.
just yeah, exactly. This is the reductionist element
Right.
of it, whereas like, but that's the other thing. That's why he keeps going back to optical schema and everything, images. That's production, you know.
Mhm.
And maybe that's also just to really go out on a limb here, but with DNG, it's like when we talk about production, it's kind of like everything. I think what their issue with Lacanianism is that like they think of it as reductive because it has to do with lack.
Right.
Whereas like production is what's
Yeah.
actually going on here. But that's I don't think that's relevant. I don't know what I'm talking about. But like
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is something being produced. Obviously, the subject and the or the ego in the optical schema, but just not productive in this like Spinozist vitalist way that DNG are. And the reason why they don't like Lacanianism and lack is because that's dialectical, right? They have a problem with the dialectic, so
I'm
they
gonna
opt for what's up.
I'm gonna clip up right just this point just for negative maps.
Right. Yeah. That's the fact of like that lack is ontologically structured into the symbolic order and the way that subjectivity, you know, determines itself. There's always that negativity, that lack. Um, but I wouldn't say that it's productive, but there's always this like it's both its limit and also the overcoming of that limit, but it never like totalizes in the way that anti-Hegelianism in French theory assumed it to be, because they're thinking of Hegel as like Hegel of synthesis, right? They're not thinking of it as
Right.
self-relating negativity, ontological contradictions, repetition, in the way that Zizek and Todd McGowan bring it to light. That's the difference. And so, like this notion that D&G and others like him, because they're creating the minor literature of philosophy, they want to do away with Hegel, and yet they want to keep the notion of Kant of like always having a limit, right? Of the limit of what we can know. And then they take on the Spinozist, Bergsonian like way of vitalism, of positive determination. And it's also like in the fact it's like for them, they're decentering subjectivity. They're not worried about subjectivity. They're worried about like assemblages of things. And with them, they use their fancy terms, machinic, desire and production. But desire is like this determined flow that's always producing things, because it is in a sense like a part of like what they would call like the world being the body without organs, right? So there's no center to the world, and there's no center to desire in the form of lack, or like structural lack, or it determining like to become a consciousness or subjectivity. Rather, it always comes back to like this distinction of like to kind of like sum down what I'm saying, like the distinction of like what Kant and Schelling said. So Kant said, what does mind have to be for nature to exist? It's for Schelling, it's like, what does nature have to be for the mind to emerge? So they're more of like, what are the flows and productions of nature in the material world for something like desire? And for Deleuze, it's like difference and repetition, but not of consciousness to subjectivity, right?
Yeah, no, I dig all of that. I still don't know what desire means for
them it's just another. Yeah, for them it's just like they see it as libido. They're being Freudians in that sense, and they're polymorphously
But
perverse.
then
Like
how do you not just fall back into the Jungian trap of desexualizing the
well,
libido?
no, they actually sexualize it. They just see is it sexuality not trying to sublimate itself, but rather assemblage theory. And the
Okay.
way that I understand it is that if you take polymorphous perversity, a thing which they do, they put it on its head and think that, well, they're not duped to believe in just purely genital love, right? They think that you could make, because everything could be machinic, partial objects are machinic. So mapping the body and mapping partial objects of the body to assemble onto other things, because it is libidinal, rather than trying to find representation, if that
But
makes sense. Like,
they don't fall into the same trap as Ballant, though, with trying to reach the plane of genital love in that sense, like without realizing it, maybe like unconsciously kind of falling into that trap.
maybe, but I think that's why they're always talking about that deterritorialization is never a positive thing, and you could end up going back into reterritorializing the same thing, right? And trying to deterritorialize the codes of capitalism, you might end up falling into fascism.
Yeah, only because like it seems like with Ballant wants to make perversion this form of primary love, right? Is that what he calls it, primary love, or
So yeah, primary love,
that's like
yeah,
kind of like it's like a for itself,
right.
and
And I
that
believe that primary love happens with the relationship between the child and the mother, but the mother's object of the love, which is her affection or love, right? That's what primary love is. And then I got to read Ballant, but I think that he believes to overcome the Oedipal complex and the Oedipal rivalry is through the attainment of genital love, which is a more moralistic thing and kind of mirrors that of the primary love. So the love that you have for your mother, in a sense, or the object of love that you got from your mother, you'll achieve it in the way of like, hey, you interact with people, and even in love life, like a nurturing type thing,
Yeah.
right? But
I have
yeah,
some thought. I want to talk to Cody about this because like
yeah,
I want to get to the problem of desire and DNG, but like
yeah,
let's get back to like behaviorism. I think it's interesting what he says here. Um, it's not because it doesn't take into account of the notion of consciousness where it fails. It's like, no, that's cool. Like consciousness is useless. We don't need that as a concept to do any kind of analysis. But there's no intersubjective relation,
yeah.
the dimension of that, which, you know, we talked to Todd McGowan about this. Like eventually he's going to
Get
leave
rid of it.
behind intersubjective
Right.
relations, but right now it's like of chief importance.
Yeah. And I think maybe
And
just
like,
because he wants to get rid of his like phenomenology aspect of it, so that's why he stops with intersubjectivity. But right here, right, what makes the intersubjectivity important for him is because then we get into overall, not only do things mirror, it's like what keeps that mirroring going on. And that is, of course, we talked about in seminar one and the lure of that and of the image and captation and captivation. But we are talking about fascination and frustration and rivalry. What's interesting about fascination, the homie Becker was saying in his video that fascination comes from like the Latin word fascinare, which means to bewitch or enchant. So there's this like magical act of being enchanted or bewitched by this alienated image, right, that you identify with. And it's almost like, again, like like using like a Marxist notion. It's like, sedated, right, like the opium of the masses. Like, if we look at the way subjectivity is a commodity now in late stage capitalism and what Zizek is critiquing, it's like as if we're constantly being fascinated by new commodified forms that appeal to our lack and our desire, and therefore we create the mirror stage with those things.
well, you know what else fascination is cognate with is fascism, which is derived from like the fasces, which
Right,
is like in ancient Rome, you know, they had those on their standards, which would like
right, right,
a binding together.
right,
Kind of
right.
interesting that all of these different meanings are like connected.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Um, damn, I'm starting to
Yeah, and
fade, but like,
like right here is like the point is like what this has to do with rivalry and frustration is that like at some point like the master slave dialectic then like creates the frustration in which one has the ability to take away the fascination that you have of yourself or the lure that you have of yourself because of the intersubjectivity, right? But that's always on the imaginary level, right? It's the symbolic order and the rules of the rivalry that you know allow for, again, what we talked about in the first one. It's like the risk of dying to become the master is part of the symbolic order, right? It's part of the rules. And in here, uh like what we have, it seems like, is not just the risk of dying, but like overall the recognition is the main thing, but to be recognized as what, right? A certain title and
symbolic.
symbolic, right? And if we put this in the realm of the clinic, um, this rivalry of you and the analyst and the transference when the analyst is not feeding into your demands. And I want to go back to what we said first when you were mentioning the thing about like there's no secret knowledge that the analyst has, and they're not writing anything secretive or profound in discovering, the key to your heart or the key to, your destiny on that paper and or that notepad and with, like what they're writing down. but you're duped to believe that when you say something, and you see them writing down, like, what are you writing down? And it's like maybe they were just like, oh, just writing down like a grocery list so I don't forget like what to get when I go to the store after this. And so then it's just like, well, are you even really an analyst because you're not paying attention to anything I said? So then there becomes that rivalry of just like trying to decenter or ridicule the analyst and take his or her position, and then like maybe you try to become the master or tear them apart so you could get the agalma of them. So you can kind of see that, in the analytic situation of this master slave dialectic.
Right. It's like you're trying to uncover the science behind the technique as just, well, not even science, as something that's just like pure charlatanry.
Right.
It's like,
yeah, exactly.
what
right.
you're doing, like, oh, because that's like a point that people reach. It's like, this is worthless, it's pointless, your technique is bullshit, this isn't science. As if saying that in any way changes what's going on.
And here's the reason why this is like this, I think, in my like personal opinions. It's like, yeah, analysis, analytic theory is getting bigger and broader because like the thanks of like Zizek and making Lacan famous and all this and that. But like analysis is not abundant like CBT and psychotherapy. So specific people go to psychoanalysis. They're not being necessarily recommended by insurance companies or agencies.
Yeah,
that's a
good point.
And so they believe that there's going to be something that they could get because they want to go to analysis.
Right.
That's also something like that. The analyst has, the cure for their symptom. The analyst has this, and then in these like moments of rivalry, right? Because there is this relationship to the analyst and the patient, but the point is that the analyst isn't guiding the treatment or guiding the patient, guiding the patient. The analyst needs to guide the treatment, not the patient. We already saw this with Anna Freud in the scenario in Seminar 1. But at the same time, that I said that the analyst is not the lawgiver, so the analyst does not need to be like, projecting or, moralizing them or trying to be like the dictator, pretty much, because then they try to be the master. The point is that the analyst has no master's discourse. Right.
Yeah, it constitutes a discourse of its own where the analyst is in the position of object A, which is interesting because in the other discourses, object A is like either produced or the cause of, right? It's like it's always somewhere there. Whereas like I think with the analyst discourse, like the object A is already there from the start. So it's never the product. It's never something reaped from what is sown. It's like already there for you.
Right.
Which creates a problem because then there's nothing to be gained in a sense.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know. It's something that just occurred to me.
Yeah. And like I think like to end on the whole master slave dialectic and fascination is just like the point is like to use these terms that the analyst is not going to make you a master, nor are you going to continue to be a slave in this dialectic. And you sure as hell is not going to be the master and make the analyst the slave. The point is to get rid of to sublate all that, right? To be neither master or neither slave.
Yeah. Like, because that's like one kind of discourse, a certain kind of political discourse, like an anarchist discourse, no masters, that kind of thing. But I guess without sounding too anti-leftist, I guess it's like that's what Lacan was pointing out when he says like, if you want a master, get one.
Exactly. Right.
Because when you say no masters, it's kind of like, well, you're not really subverting the master's discourse. You're asking for a master.
Exactly. Yeah, especially when people are just like, like they just want like recognition. And that applies today, especially like the Me Too movement and all these other different movements. Or like, I think I've seen this on TikTok a long ass time ago, but it was just like this thing of like a bunch of libs, and they had this poster that said "Peg the patriarchy," as if that's subverting the master. It's like, well, in what way does pegging make that non-patriarchal?
Yeah, because if you're pegging them, it's like at some level you're recognizing them as the master.
Right. Yeah.
Or in assuming the role of the master, what guarantee do you have that you won't simply reduplicate their
Right.
form of mastery in a way that's equally oppressive or violent?
Right. You're trying to subvert their phallus, but what do you use? You use a phallus, which is or a dildo to peg them, right? But it takes place as the phallus, signified by the fake penis.
Right. Um. All right.
Yeah.
What's the coda of all of this? How can we just like sum it up?
Well, I think right there, like overall, like we know that everything behaves like mirrors, and that's how consciousness functions in this mirroring and fascination. Or what we could talk about, like the ego is mirroring the fascination, and the whole speculative thing is like, well, what if there were no, watery lakes, or like lakes with like the images and yada 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 yada, like would the image still exist? Will we have cameras? But that was just a speculative thing. The point is that everything acts like a mirror, or at least records the image like a camera. And um, this whole thing of reflecting and mirroring takes place exactly in the analytical situation, right? The analyst is not trying to understand the nature of consciousness. The analyst is trying to listen, and you are working through and historicizing, yourself, and the analyst wants to, at least in the Lacanian sense, is not getting too excited, not using these Lacanian terms as mouthwash and just spewing them onto the you know patient, the analyst, and they're not saying like the problem is that you have death drive. The problem is that you have this tree that, no, they're not doing that. They're not talking about like the objet because yeah, a patient goes to a psychoanalyst specifically rather than going to a regular therapist, but not all of them are going to know this language, right? They come from all different walks of background. So the point is to not already diagnose them on that part, and to listen and know that they're going to try to mirror on you, but don't fall into their demands or their rivalry when they get frustrated because their fascination of you or how they see themselves in you, especially if we have a narcissist, on the couch, that you don't give ground relative to the desire, because they're the ones that are going to kind of project the master slave dialectic on you. But the analysts can do that themselves with the countertransference. And some would argue, say that there is no countertransference, there's just transference. All it is just transference on the analyst side. The point is that you just have to be mindful of it, because that doesn't guide the treatment. And for Lacan, he's not down with countertransference because of how ego psychology of his time was using it as a technique to get into the realm of the unconscious.
Right.
That's all I got.
I'm just rereading this part here, which I thought was interesting because he brings it back to machines.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I don't know that we totally addressed his notion of machines and like how that.
Well, I did say, I
What made
was
you?
saying,
Yeah, tell me.
I was saying about how, like, we remember, like, when we were talking about the camera, and how the image is held within the camera. We should see the camera as what he'll say later as it being a machine, and that the machine is what allows for the ego to function, or what we talk about desire, right? Um, the whole camera metaphor is a metaphor for the symbolic order and its functioning, and the way it retains the image and allows the image to function and mirror. Like how are things able to operate as mirrors, right? Well, one is going to be subjectivities, fascination and lure, but desire guides that, especially like in the fascination, right? Not just fascination of like the waking, everyday conscious waking things, but how you're fascinated and caught in this image of yourself in daydreams. Like you were saying, how like people will be willing to talk about their dreams, but not their daydreams, right? There's this
Right.
fascination of how you look and resemble in this scene in the daydream, right? And that lures you. You get fascinated by that, bewitched by it, because you really think that that's yourself.
And you rebel when you reach the point
Yeah.
of this. You, the other, who is my unity, you desire that. The frustration involves the fact that your unity is dependent on the existence of the other, the you, and that it's a mirroring, and the fact that it's
Right.
a mirroring is frustrating.
Right.
um Also, it's interesting. Is this the first time he says one receives one's own message from the other in an inverted form? Does he
Yeah,
say
he does.
that
Yeah,
somewhere else?
he's this is the first time he says that, and then
Oh,
like,
nice. So we have like a
and
historic
we'll,
moment here.
yeah, we'll get that in another chapter. I want to say on the circuit where he talks about like uh the way like communication, the wires of like uh fucking telegrams or cell phones or whatever, or not cell phones, but just like the phones of the day operate. And like sometimes you'll get like a delay. It's almost like that inverted message or inverted form has a delay to it.
Right, because you don't recognize it as your own message,
Right. Yeah.
and it's jarring in that sense.
Right. Yeah.
Well, if I understand what you're getting at. But what's fascinating is like also we have we just talk about fascination. I feel like I always use that term too. Fascinating. What's fascinating as well, like this idea of knowledge in the pure state is what he says. It's not in the pure state. And I was thinking of something people talk about, like how people talk about virtue signaling.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like they're getting at something true. Oftentimes people who talk about virtue signaling, they're coming from a more conservative point of view and shitting on like woke people, for example, where, and like this is something that like, yeah, like people who are like very woke will do, where it's like where you, I don't know, cite a statistic about a certain group of people, or just like, you let people know that you're supposedly an ally, or like something,
Right.
or like a really cringy version of that was like, I think after Trump was elected, people were wearing like safety pins or some shit, like to, I don't know,
Yeah.
remember how it became associated with like being an ally, but like even saying like I'm an ally is like lame, but like people realize like it's like you don't want to just come out and say it, so it's like you signal it in other ways. But on the other hand, it's like everything we do is a kind of signaling, is what he's saying. So it's
Right.
like we're always trying to convey with our messages, not like the content of those messages, but rather like trying to signal to the other in the hopes that we will receive recognition by,
Exactly.
basically arranging signifiers in the right order. And
Right.
like what is this, and like what is the illusion of like a kind of like woke mentality, but the thought that there can be this sort of like bureaucratic apparatus which can figure out the correct way to arrange signifiers in just such a way that every element of, like, let's say like victimhood is recognized, acknowledged as such, appreciated, and placed in the right spot in order for its own like truth and identity to come forward. Like that is
Right.
what the illusion of wokeism
Well, you should see
promises.
Channel 5 to be the one that puts the subject in question with the episode of the allies and the quote unquote socialists
Yeah,
with
yeah, yeah,
reparations.
yeah. With the Uhuru, it's great because it's kind of like that guy's like, well, basically he doesn't say it, but he's just kind of like, like, hey, I'm a black dude right here
Yeah.
talking to you white people who seem to be really concerned with the notion of me getting reparations. What if we just do it at the local level right now? Can I have
Yeah.
$20?
Yeah.
And
And
it's
it's
sort of
like,
like, it's fascinating because it's that disconnect between the abstract utopian goal of it versus
right.
like I am immediately in my particularity
Right.
embodiment of exactly what you're talking about. Can I have some money?
Right. And then there becomes like the, maybe it's a disavowal, but the fact it's like the concrete in your face immediacy always comes in like a performative excess, or just like an excess in general. And therefore it's just like you have to like disavow it. Right.
The excess of it, like the excess is the gesture itself, right? Which is
Right.
everything,
Yeah.
because what's revealed there, it's like kind of like, yo, you giving money to anybody in the moment like has impact in terms of like what they'll do with that money, whereas
Right.
it's sort of like everything else that they're doing in that episode is like purely gestural,
Right.
and it's like, but that's the last thing they would want to think about what they're doing, is that it's a gesture,
Yeah.
it's an elaboration of a kind of gesture. And that's like the performance art aspect of it, where it is performative. That said, though, it's impossible to get away from
Right.
the performance element of it, like that, because people will also like take each other to task on the left for like questioning what their involvement, and what have you really done, like I want results, like are like they will purity test each other in terms of just like,
Right.
are you just performing, or are you the real deal? Like,
Right.
give me
Right.
statistics, what have you done to improve the lots of people's lives? And like that also doesn't make much sense, it's like
Exactly.
um that's a good episode. Uhuru. You haven't, you gotta watch Channel 5 right now. It's like, it's great.
Yeah.
um
Keeping it 55th Street.
Crip Mac, we're gonna have him on the channel very soon. Noted Lacanian Crip Mac.
Don't commit symbolic suicide, or else it'll be a Custer.
Only Custers commit symbolic suicide. So I know there's some things we didn't like quite, there's some niceties here that we didn't quite address, but hey, you got to read Lacan,
Yeah,
right? That
yeah,
we're not a replacement for reading Lacan.
yeah. Don't
Got to
give ground
go
relative to
through
your
it.
desire of attention economy.
You got to
Yeah,
go, you got to go through it. You can't go
and
around it with our help. But
yeah, don't demand that we have some special knowledge of Lacan that we're gatekeeping.
yeah, and we always ask for critiques, criticisms. You can slide in the comments and just tell us that we have no business talking about what we're
Yeah.
talking about, and that'll just inspire me more. So
Right, right. And if we don't have a Patreon, but if we did, and like, you paid me money so that you could ramble around about your critique of Lacan and me explain, I'm just gonna count money loudly while you talk. Just like Lacan did, and sip on my tea.
if you do want to give us money, just send us a DM and
Yeah.
say I want to pay you, and we'll figure it out. we don't even need we don't even need a Patreon. Just like hit us up directly.